Declare open this supplementary public hearing for inquiry into budget estimates for education and early learning. Before I commence, it's the custom of this parliament to acknowledge the traditional inhabitants of this land, the Gadigal people of Aurora Nation, and I do that with all due respect, as well as acknowledging other important contributors to the history of this site, those who constructed the Parliament House building, very often working in a dangerous industry, and the parliamentary staff over many decades who supported MPs and made our work and representative role possible. We acknowledge and thank them all. I welcome departmental officials to this hearing today. The committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolio of education and early learning. Before we commence, I'd like to make a few brief comments about the procedures. Today's hearing is being broadcast live on the Parliament's website, and the proceedings are also recorded, and a transcript will be placed on the website once it becomes available from the Hansard. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, the House has authorised the filming, broadcasting and photography of committee proceedings by representatives of media organisations from any positions in the room and by any member of the public from any position in the audience. Any person filming proceedings must take responsibility for the proper use of that material. All witnesses in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness according to the procedural fairness resolution adopted by our chamber in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time. You take those on notice. Everyone here knows the drill. If witnesses wish to hand up documents, they should do so through the committee staff, and you're also free to pass your notes and refer directly to your advisors seated behind you. And if everyone could also turn off their mobile phones to silent. Otherwise, under Labor policy, Courtney Housos will confiscate them. Witnesses are sworn in. You've all done that under budget estimates previously. We're going to have a hearing today from 10 till 1:30 p.m. with a 15-minute break at 11:45. And during these questions, this session, there will be questions from the opposition and crossbench members only. If required, 15 minutes is available at the end of the session for government questions from the Honourable Scott Farlow, if he so avails himself. Thank you, witnesses, for your attendance today, and we'll begin with questions from the opposition. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back again. I wanted to start with this idea that is being trialled in Leppington, Denham Court and Edmondston Park for a school board to determine which schools local kids can attend. I wanted to ask who is on the board?
So thank you for the question. If I could just, before I answer that, just let the committee know that we have emerging issues across the state, obviously with rising floodwaters still in some communities, and it may be that particularly Mr Disdale or Ms Nixon need to step out, given we also have the HSC running today, if there are issues arising. I'll ask Mr Disdale to talk about that shared enrolment model that you referred to, Ms Housos, and provide you with some more information.
Morning, Ms Housos.
Good morning.
Happy to get you the full composition on notice, but my working knowledge is it's got the principals on there of the 3 schools where we've got the shared intake area, so that's Denham Court, Leppington, Edmondston Park.
Yep.
It's got P&C representation, but I don't have the full composition in front of me. I can certainly get that for you.
Okay, that would be helpful, and if you can even get it back for us today, that would be great. I understand and I acknowledge the the broader issues that are being dealt with by the Department of Education today. But if you could get that back for us, I'm sure during 1:30.
Today's hearing, in between questions, I'll give you the. I'll have my office give me the full composition.
That would be great. So. So my understanding is that this school board will allocate the children amongst the 3 schools. What are the factors that are going to be taken into consideration?
So we announced a shared intake area in a growth corridor, as you'd appreciate, at Denham Court, at Leppington and Edmondston Park. Our principals advised us of the 3 schools when we were meeting with them that this was the best way to go. Because of the growth corridor and the uncertainty of settlement patterns in a full state, they didn't want to lock in a firm boundary for each of the sites. We think that's a wise move to undertake. We will review those boundaries every 12 months, Ms Housos, and when we get to a time where we feel as though the settlement patterns are a lot more concrete, we'll certainly give firmer assurance. So in line with our enrolment policy, the factors that we'll take into account are 1, proximity of the residents to the school or schools in question. We'll obviously be taking into account siblings and giving priority to keep families together at their request. They'll be the two overriding factors. We'll also need to take into account any extenuating circumstances. There'll always be, in public schools, applications for out of area, in this case, shared area, for a particular site where it might not be, where another school may be even closer, but the family want to attend a particular school because there are particular circumstances to take into account, like family circumstances, AVOs, legal proceedings, etc., etc.
So what will the appeals process be if, for example, a parent is unhappy with the school that they are allocated to?
Yes, very good question. Again, in line with the enrolment procedures, if they are unhappy with the communication that is provided by way of the committee's decision, then they can appeal to the director and executive director, and at times some of those appeals come to me as well in my role as Deputy Secretary.
Okay, and you said that it's going to be reviewed every 12 months?
Yes.
So when's the first review due?
Well, these shared enrolment boundaries for those three schools are now underway as of last week. We will review those in 2023 and communicate again to those three school communities whether we will continue that in 2024 or we're in a position for firmer boundaries. I think in what we've been briefed on numbers in the area, by way of families, enrolment applications, etc. It'll take a few years, Ms Housos, to settle down with settlement patterns and firmer boundaries. Edmondson Park, remember, Ms Housos, is starting day one next year, so it's it has not kicked off as a school, but we're taking enrolment, so take a few years to firm up, but we've committed to make sure we keep evaluating those boundaries every 12 months.
And what's the capacity at Edmondson Park?
My colleague, Mr Manning, will be able to assist, but initially we have capacity for 1,000, if I'm correct, Mr Manning, and then we can increase from there if necessary.
It's a base new school, so capacity is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200.
Yep.
Can I just ask Mr Disder, in relation to the decisions of the committee, are they done by consensus or is it intended to be a voting body?
Let me get that detail for you when I get the composition. It's not a voting exercise, is my understanding. It's an exercise in considering the applications in front of us and making as best decisions possible by way of the two overriding criteria of proximity to a school. Obviously, with primary schools, Ms Jackson, we like to encourage families to be able to walk to school. Families like to be able to take their young children to school by way of exercise and walk, so that's going to be an overriding factor. These schools, Ms Jackson, also have the USH provision, which is going to be very important for working families, and so we're imagining there's going to be strong proportions of these schools that are dropped off, the children are dropped off very early, so again, you know, proximity is going to be very important. That's going to be the overriding factor. And then the secondary most important factor is siblings, keeping families together. We don't want families to be able to be in a position where we communicate that one child is at one school and from this committee we're communicating that the other child will have to go to another school, because that's going to add to transportation and workload for families.
Obviously, it's clear that, you know, it would be preferable if all of the applications came in and everyone's top preference, you know, and it all allocated fairly and evenly. Great if that happens. Obviously, potentially that doesn't happen and there are too many first preference requests for one, for example, of the schools. And so decisions will have to be made about which families are allocated, for example, their second preference. And I'm just interested to know if there's a conflict amongst members of the committee, how that will be managed. I mean, in a way you've said you've taken that on notice, but that, you know, that is, I guess, what I'm getting at, which is if there are two applicants, you know, one has to have their second preference. Some members think it should be applicant A, other members think it should be applicant B. That would be useful. And as a follow-up, the process for managing conflicts of interest, particularly for representatives from the school community who may be, for example, P&C reps. These people may know each other. You know, how are we going to ensure that those decisions are made objectively and that conflict of interest is managed?
Yeah, I'm very confident that that'll be the case. We've had this in other locations as well, so I can give you an example of that. And let me also, Ms Jackson, just go back to Ms Houssos's question, because I've got the answer for the composition, Ms Houssos. It's got the panel will be the three principals of the three schools, the three P&C members, one from each school, and a staff member from each school.
And how are the parent reps chosen, the P&C reps? Are they elected or are they appointed?
We'll leave that to the P&C of each school to nominate and use their normal procedures to give us a representative for this committee.
Just so there is a process for declaring conflict of interest?
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, your own child's application, you might be on that committee and your own child's application might be coming forward to that committee, so there'll naturally need to be conflict of interest procedures. Georges River College is another one where we've had shared enrolments, and we've recently, this has been the first year where we've given families options across the campus, and that's a process that's worked really well. I've had no appeals in the entire 2022 school year. The school year's not finished, so I should cross my fingers that it keeps going really well. It has. And having also met with the principals myself, they're really driven by their system mentality of trying to get this optimally for each and every family that comes before them. They understand that they're there on that committee, not for their own site, but as representatives of public education for that entire educational area. We'll continue to liaise with the schools and the committee. They've got a lot of work in front of them because term 4 we want to firm up all those enrolment decisions, and we'll have a good radar on how that's played out later this term. The normal appeal procedures will be there if they're necessary as well, and I think this is a very sensible move and a very wise move given it's a expanding area. Having driven out there myself, I was quite taken aback by the growth in residential dwellings since I'd last been there. So it's an area that can accelerate at a faster rate than the planners may have even thought. So not having firm boundaries locked in is really important to get it right in a longer state. And our communication, I should add, you might be interested, our communication to each of the school communities has been really well received. We've had no negative feedback. We've had it translated and I think well comprehended. P&C have been on board.
So you said that the P&C reps, one from each school. Edmonston Park is obviously a new school.
Yes.
How is that P&C appointing their rep?
I understand that we've already got a P&C at Edmondson Park. They're involved in the merit selection of the principal. It's not unusual to stand up a prospective parent body for a new school. Obviously won't be in the strength of numbers of an established school, but my understanding is that we did have parent representation when we merit selected the principal, and that was a parent who was going to look to enrol their child at that school. So my understanding is that there is a working P&C that's already kicked off, and all credit to them to get up and running that quickly.
Okay. You said that there's been no appeals in Georges River with a similar kind of school board structure in place. Is there a school board structure in place anywhere else in the state?
I'm just going into the annals of my working knowledge across my footprint. I'd have to probably take it on notice. We've had, if I think of straight away, Homebush, Strathfield, Concord, where we've had single sex and we've had co-ed provision. There's been provision for families who want to have a single sex education as opposed to a co-ed or vice versa.
Mr. Disdar, I'm asking you if there's actually a formal school board structure in place anywhere else in the state. You said that there is in Georges River. I'm just interested to know whether there's a formal school board structure where it's taking joint enrolments.
Yeah, so let me take that on notice and come back to you on that.
Okay, but off the top of your head, you're not aware of any?
Off the top of my head, I'm certainly aware of shared enrolment structures, and that's what I was unpacking for you as well at Homebush there in Strathfield. But your specific question is around a committee that makes the decisions on the enrolment. So let me take that on notice.
Okay, if you can come back to us today, that would be quite helpful. Ms Nixon, you obviously look after...
I'll do my best. If I can come back today like I did with the committee composition, I certainly will. If I can't, I'll have to come back to you on notice.
No, Ms Housos, I'm not aware either.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I'm interested to know what how was this decision taken to establish the school board?
We consulted with the school principals of the 3 schools like I indicated. We consulted with our minister's office. School performance where I'm responsible.
Oh, can you say the first person you said you consulted with the minister's office?
I should have used the word briefed. We briefed the minister's office on options for consideration that school performance, where I'm responsible for in the South, alongside school infrastructure, had worked on at a senior officer level. So our director on the ground, our executive director, myself as the deputy secretary responsible there for schools, worked with our infrastructure colleagues on options that we may consider. As you're aware, given the population limitation for the school at Denham Court, Ms Housos, you're across the fact that it's legislated that we can only have 1,000 people on that site at any one time. So we've been monitoring...
Because it's next to a gas pipeline, isn't it correct?
That's my understanding, yes, and that's been communicated to the school community and all school communities in that area. So operationally, we've been monitoring the enrolments this year, and about 6 to 8 weeks ago, we all sat down and started to consider the options, recognising that we were coming close to that population limitation at Denham Court. A number of options were considered. We briefed the Minister's office. Myself, our ED and Del, alongside the Minister, consulted with the principals, and then we firmed up the recommended option, which was announced to the community.
Sorry, Mr Disdar, I had thought, perhaps I heard wrong, that you said earlier, or you suggested earlier, that the principals were the ones that had proposed this idea to you.
When we were, Ms Jackson, when we were considering all options, our DEL, the Director of Educational Leadership for those local schools, had been working with the principals because we've got a new school coming on board. Leppington was going through a capital upgrade. Denham was in its first year of operations. So I stand by what I indicated to you. The principals had suggested already this option of a shared enrolment intake area, and that was fed into the work that then we undertook around the options to consider and provide to the Minister. They had done some embryonic work around that. They had considered it, and they had then provided that to us.
Okay, and the way that this works in practice, everyone has the same enrolment form, or are parents told about it at the outset, or how is it communicated to parents?
This decision that we undertook?
The fact that if you're enrolling your child, how are you told? Do you receive an enrolment form that says you could be allocated to any of these 3 schools? Or do you receive an enrolment form for Edmundston Park or for Denham Court or for Leppington, and then it's communicated with you afterwards?
Yeah, so we did put out a communication to each school community. It was the same communication. Happy to get you a copy of that, Ms Housos, because it goes into the detail of how to do it. It is one generic enrolment form, the system enrolment form. Obviously, we're capturing the residential address. Obviously, we're taking into account the preferred location for that family. There's an opportunity for them to express that. And then it's made clear in the communication that will communicate that back to them from the committee's findings.
Yeah, if you can provide that on
Would you
notice,
like
that
a
would be
copy
helpful.
of-
Yes, thank you very much.
We can get you one of those.
So I'm interested in the media release. I understand, ministers' offices prepare media releases and you would prepare media releases. The department would. Who prepared the media release that was dated the 21st of October 2022 that made this announcement? From the minister.
I would have to take that on notice. What would have happened is that School Infrastructure New South Wales and School Performance, where I indicate I was responsible for, would have had input into its creation and its way up to the Minister's office.
Okay, I'm just interested
If I
to know.
may, but ultimately a media announcement from the Minister is the responsibility and accountability of the Minister and her staff. So we would provide input on the facts of those matters. We would at times attach a draft media release containing those facts, but we then would only see it once it had been released, generally speaking, in the same form. Because
Okay, I mean, the title says more school choice for growing South West Sydney communities. It's not actually more school choice. It's actually just going to be allocated by a school board. You would accept that?
So I think we are the wrong people to ask that question of. We did not. I don't believe that strapline came from us.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Now, I just wanted to ask one final question before my time runs out. At Denham Court Public School, there's obviously a restriction because it's next to a gas pipeline. Is this something that's common, Ms Harrison, at schools? How?
So I'll ask Mr Manning to provide further comment, but what I would say is this, our schools are in the middle of communities. Our school does not sit on an island outside the rest of the community. Those community needs services, and those services include things like supply of gas, and so there are at times through communities and including impacting on our school, those supply issues we have to work around, but Mr Manning can provide you more detail in terms of the overall footprint.
I think from memory we've only got probably 3 or 4 schools, including this one, that are within the 760 metre zone of the gas main. We have some that are outside of that and therefore not as impacted under the legislation, but I think we've got 3 or 4 that see it. Some of them are historic, but it's only in recent years I think that the legislation has been everybody's been a bit more aware of it and been a bit more focused on the enforcement of it. So it is something that we're aware of and we'll continue to monitor.
So those 3 or 4 schools, do you know them, Mr Manning? Are you
I
able
can
to
provide them to you on notice. I don't have that list with me, but happy to provide them on notice.
You've got 8 seconds.
Okay, that's excellent.
We'll pass to Ms Abigail Boyd on WebEx. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to all of you. I wanted to start by asking about this announcement about the behaviour czar and where that idea originated and where that proposal is up to.
Thank you for the question, Ms Boyd. We were asked to provide advice to the Minister in relation to the role a behaviour advisor could play across all school sectors following a series of incidents involving students from independent schools, as well as concerns about how that may be going across school boundaries in terms of school sectors and making sure we had consistency in some of those approaches. So in terms of where it is up to, I can ask Mr Graham to provide you with some further detail on the progress we have made so far on implementation.
Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. So at the moment we are working with the Minister's office around the appointment details. So the Chief Behaviour Advisor will be advising through the Schools Council, which consists of all sectors, Catholic, independent and government schools, and they'll be involved in the selection process. There'll also be an international search that'll be undertaken as well for the appointment.
And do you have a salary level at which this person is going to be paid?
No, we're currently looking at the roles and responsibilities, the kind of experience and so on that role would need. Also the kind of amount of time that role might take up. There are different models and the salary will be set according to those factors.
Ms Harrison, was the idea based on the UK, I think they called him Tory Tom, the UK behaviour czar?
So I believe that is where the request came from in terms of research done by policy advisors into those models overseas, and we were asked to provide advice on how such a model could work here in New South Wales.
And was any assessment made of the impact of that model in the UK? Why was it seen to be an appropriate model for Australia?
I think that following the issues that we had seen across sectors, as I indicated before, there was clearly a need across all sectors identified for there to be some consistency and a shared approach about how we might tackle some of those issues, especially as they work across school cohorts who mingle and socialise outside of school. As I said before, we were asked to provide advice on what that could look like here. We provided that advice, and the government made its decision and announced the Chief Behaviour Advisor that we're in the process of finalising the appointment of, well, the process for the appointment of.
Did you consider the different cultures within private schools and public schools and the different drivers for what is being seen as poor behaviour, and certainly in relation to those very public private school discussions? I think everyone was very shocked. But the idea that we would respond in such a way with something that then is directed towards the entire school system, what was the logic there?
So as I indicated in my previous answer, Ms Boyd, clearly in those examples there was suggestion that the groups of students spanned a number of sectors, and therefore as we look at the issues that are within young people's worlds, they are not bound by the school they go to. Students engage with each other outside the school gate, and so it is important therefore that in terms of setting the standards for that behaviour and those expectations around some of the issues that were raised in those examples, that we seek to have consistency across the three sectors. And certainly I want to thank the independent and Catholic sectors for the way they have come to the table on this issue and have supported it and signed up to the idea that we would maintain those shared high standards.
The idea of, so we get this kind of high profile case at a private school that smacks of elitism and privilege. And then we take the reaction to that and apply it to a bunch of other schools that are having lots and lots of problems, of which this is probably not the top of the list. Did you consult with the unions before?
And so I think, as I've indicated, we were asked to provide advice to the Minister on these issues. We provided advice to the Minister on the issue, and the Minister and the government made a decision on their policy position moving forward, as is their right as the government of the day.
This model in the UK has been particularly bad for children with disability. And I think when you look at the huge numbers of, the huge teacher shortages that we have in New South Wales, the strain that our schools are already under, why on earth would you make a recommendation for some sort of behaviour czar to sit across public schools when that is patently on the evidence not what is required? Was this just a knee-jerk reaction to a problem at a private school?
So, Ms Boyd, I'm not here to pass comment on the judgments made by others, but I think the thing I would say is I wouldn't want to preempt here the role that behaviour czar will play in our system. We are different. I also don't want to presume the outcomes of the UK model as they would apply here on a model that is currently being designed. And so we are designing the role. We're in consultation with the other sectors. In public education, we are very clear on the agenda we have around the support for students with disability and the progress we are making and want to continue to make in that area. We have just implemented our new inclusive, respectful and engaging education reforms. We do not see those changing. But what we do see are challenges at times for schools where having access to expert advice, having consistency around standards could very much be useful. And so I don't want to preempt the nature of the advisor we would have, the nature of their role, and assume it would be unhelpful when actually I think there is a good opportunity for us here to align around a clear set of standards and expectations and a clear and shared way of working through these issues across sectors.
So it's been suggested that this person will be paid in the order of
So, Ms Boyd, I think as Mr Martin indicated, we are currently doing the analysis around the nature of the role, of the levels and the appropriate level of remuneration that would go with that. So I don't think it is helpful for us to hypothesise about what that could be. We are doing the work. The work will be, the job will be evaluated, and we will set an appropriate remuneration scale from there.
Sure, but given that that is, you know, at the lower end of the scale for the usual government bureaucrat, you would expect it would be at least that amount, wouldn't you?
I think many of the staff in the Department of Education certainly would not agree that's the standard salary for a public servant. I note that we have a panel here, but at that level, I think it would depend on the nature of the role we're asking the individual to play. I think it would depend on the number of days per year that they were engaged to do it. I think we're working, as I've indicated, we're working through those issues, and once we've settled on them, I'm very happy for that to be transparent and to inform the committee of the outcomes.
And were you ever asked to create such a policy before it was an issue at a private school?
Certainly, I think the government's engagement around behaviour policy over the last 12 months has been a consistent focus and priority, and actually probably more over the 2 years. But specifically in relation to the advisor, this is the first time we've been asked for advice on it.
Yeah, so it's a knee-jerk reaction then to what happened in a private school. That would be correct, wouldn't it?
I think that's an assertion rather than a question I'm in a position to answer, Ms Boyd.
Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Secretary, how can you say you've got no expectations of what the behaviours is going to do by way of their role and hopefully their achievements? Are you running the education system, or you're a passive observer to what these people do? Surely you must have in your mind a clear outline of what behaviour should be in every single classroom in New South Wales and what the behaviours should achieve.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, as I indicated in my answers to Ms Boyd, this is a chief behaviour advisor for all school sectors to provide support around a range of issues, some of which to go to some very complex behaviours or societal issues that we want to work through. As a public system, we do have a clear statement of our expectations of behaviour in our public schools. We have a clear policy in place that starts from a premise of high expectations for all students at all times, and that's what we're currently in the process of implementing. And so I welcome the opportunity to bring the ongoing building of evidence around these issues for our schools to the heart of the public policy debate on these issues. I welcome the opportunity of having an expert in the field available to support schools should they need it, and available to support the development of professional learning and other engagements with our staff. So I don't accept the premise that we're a bystander. We are, however, only 2 or 3 weeks after the announcement was made, and we are working through the details of the appointment process, and we're working on that role description, and we're doing so in consultation with the other 2 sectors.
And have you seen the evidence in the Australian newspaper today from the Monash study saying the vast number of teachers who think about leaving teaching because the classroom is a jungle, they're sworn at, they're disrespected, they can't get an orderly, disciplined learning environment in which to use their skills to teach? Isn't that just a dreadful reflection on how you've been running the system?
Firstly, I would note that's a national study. I'd also note that the number of issues that were raised in that study around the behaviour teachers experienced went beyond the classroom and went to the behaviour they experienced from parts of the public debate and from parents. In New South Wales, we've been really clear on those issues. We have a parent code of conduct. We have support in place for our schools around those issues. And we do have a clear behaviour policy. And what we now have, as a result of the work we have done in the department, is a team around a school available to support interventions around individual students and around certain behaviour issues to ensure that we can address them at source, and that we can do so in a way that ensures all students continue to have access to high quality education.
But isn't there a prototype of what discipline in a classroom should be? And can I just get you to reflect on this? It's almost like no one's ever been to school. Now, even if it was 40 years ago, in my case and others, we all remember that the only way you can concentrate and learn and absorb information is an orderly, disciplined, structured learning environment, not people climbing in and out of windows, swearing at teachers, walking in and out of the classroom. Isn't there a prototype for the sort of discipline that we would want in New South Wales schools, and examples of the very few number of schools that actually achieve it?
So thank you for the question. Alongside the policy I mentioned before, we also have the What Works Best in Managing Behaviour from CESE. So we do have that very clearly articulated for our schools. My experience, Chair, in the number of schools that I visit is that I see students very much engaged in learning. I see at the times when explicit instruction, which we know is critical, is underway, that students are sat and focused for their teacher. But that we also encourage collaborative exercises and work. And so at times, I think it's one of the loveliest things when you walk around a school and you see students engaged together in their learning around certain activities that they're doing. So we see both of those things in our schools. We recognise the need to support our schools with behaviour. As I said, we have developed a team around a school model to help schools manage where they need additional support. And we are really invested in ensuring the best practice we have available to us is implemented.
What's the best disciplined school in New South Wales?
I think that would depend on your definition, Chair, but if you had a definition
Well, my definition is where it's orderly, it's structured, and the students who want to absorb information can do so without interruption, which is a basic, the foundation stone upon which any classroom and learning should be based.
And so I have seen examples of that, Chair, in every school I've visited across the state, and I'm sure my colleagues at the table have as well. We know the schools that, as we look to implementing the new behaviour policy, we have targeted the support for those schools where data around suspensions and other issues have indicated to us there are more challenges. They are the schools getting the most support to implement the new policy, and we're very much targeting that work in line with the school success model, Chair, where if we see that a school needs extra help, we are putting in the resources alongside them to make sure we address those issues.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the behaviours R model comes from the UK. Have you noted that the strictest, most disciplined, regimented school in the UK, Michaela, has just been announced as having the highest value-added results? By measurement, you could say it's the best school in the UK. Do you think that's something more than a coincidence and a model we could adopt here?
So I'd note that, well, firstly, I'd congratulate that school on its success, and I think that leader stands with incredible courage around their school and the methods that they use, and I think there are things that are articulated around that school which I think are very valid for us to consider. It's also only one school of its kind, and I note the amazing success, but at this stage we haven't seen in any system that being replicable, and I think that's an interesting question for us to look at. But
What about Marsden Road Public?
I'm very interested in seeing the ongoing evidence around that, and Marsden Park Public is a fantastic...
Marsden Road.
Marsden Road Public School is a fantastic school, Chair, and we do see great results from that school. We also do see great results from other schools, and so one of the issues around finding the evidence and making sure it's replicable is the context of that school and the community it is working within, and the choices the parents in that community have made to send their students to that school are all relevant factors, and I think we need to understand that a bit more. But I say that without wanting to take anything away from the incredible achievements of that school. And I do think that that evidence is something we need to keep a watchful eye on, and we need to see whether or not that does continue to deliver benefits over a sustained period of time and across different contexts.
Yeah, where there's evidence of these disciplinary methods achieving great school results, why do you say passively that we just need to keep an eye on that? Why don't you just implement them across the system?
So, Chair, I think to say that that would suggest that we have a scale of issue across our system in relation to behaviour impacting on student learning. That is not our evidence is the case. We are very much working at the improvement agenda in our system, and we are seeing progress from the strategies we are putting in place.
Are we? Are we? How do you explain Jennifer Buckingham's research in the past week that there are 19,000 New South Wales students who start high school semi-illiterate?
And so I think that...
19,000.
I think the work you're referring to, Chair, is from the Australian Education and Research
No, it's Jennifer Buckingham's work at Multilit.
Okay.
She put out a report. It's part of a series of reports I'm going to go to. 19,000, and this has been spoken of in the past, the 17,000. It's now up to 19,000, leaving Year 6 semi-illiterate. How can that be? If schools can teach reading, and you say there's improvement in a disciplined classroom environment, how can 19,000 students start high school semi-illiterate?
And so, Chair, we are very clear in terms of the research around what works best in our schools to support the development of literacy and numeracy skills. We too have seen the decline in writing that I think that report referred to.
No, that's ERO, that's a separate one.
And so we have put in place specific interventions.
Why are things going backwards? And how do you feel that these are mostly disadvantaged students from a disadvantaged background and your system is keeping these poor kids poor?
So, Chair, I don't accept the premise of the question. We have teachers hard at work every day in our classrooms.
I'm not after hard work, I'm after results.
I hear that, Chair, but I think one...
Not excuses, results.
One leads
and why aren't
to
you
another.
angry about it? Why aren't you worked up about it and doing something about it? These are poor kids who will be stuck in the intergenerational poverty cycle, seemingly forever, because they go to high school semi-illiterate. They go to high school, let's go to ERO, Year 9 writing levels that are at Year 9 kids at a Year 7 writing level and punctuation at Year 3.
And so, Chair, I note the progress that we have made on things like the HSC minimum standard, where we have ensured and continue to ensure, and we see the progress towards that minimum standard being achieved earlier in high school. It is not that I think those standards are where we are aiming for. What I want to do sitting here today is make sure that I do applaud the work our staff are doing across the system to make the progress that we are seeing, while remaining committed to
Where's
further
the progress
ambition
when we
beyond
get
it.
these results week after week? You said the HSC. Your own Daniel French, Director Capability Implementation and School Excellence in April, wrote that 36% of schools are on track to achieve the HSC target, 64% aren't. 38% are on track to achieve NAPLAN reading numeracy targets, 62% aren't. Isn't it just delusional to keep on saying progress is being made when we get all these indicators from Buckingham, from ERO, from Daniel French saying the system is going backwards? Poor kids are being kept poor.
And so, Chair, in terms of the HSC targets, what we know from the strategies we are implementing is that the schools that have engaged with the central support around HSC and achieving higher results for the top two bands have seen a 17% increase in their HSC results as a result of that intervention. So that's why I say we're making progress. I accept that there is a time lag to seeing that across the system, but the interventions we are putting in place are having the desired impact. And that's what I'm referring to when I say we are making progress, and we need to continue to. The thing that I would be very concerned about is if we were to lurch to an entirely different strategy at the point we're implementing things well in our schools. Sustained, focused effort to deliver improvement is what we need. We are really clear that the interventions we are making are showing results within them, and we need to make sure that we remain focused on that and can sustain our delivery of them over time.
Well, the government's chosen curriculum reviewer said we've got the fastest falling school academic results in the world. We've got data showing that 19,000 kids start high school semi-illiterate. We've got this ERO result showing that in Year 9 the writing skills are at a Year 7 level, punctuation's at a Year 3 level. And your own Daniel French has said that a heavy majority of schools aren't meeting their targets. On behalf of people who care about education in New South Wales, aren't you just delusional to keep on talking about progress? When are you going to face up to these tragic failures which hurt disadvantaged kids more than anyone else?
Mr. Latham.
Now, I don't mind someone admitting to problems, but surely there's got to be some reality here to actually confront them and deal with them. What have you got to say, Mr. Martin?
I was just going to say that I don't think historically our teachers have been as well served as they should have been by some of the syllabus documents of the last 25 years, and that some of the issues that have been raised about Cater 2, phonics inclusions in Cater 2, the sequences of writing from 3 to 6, and then the 6 into 7, the continuity into Year 7, the capacity of teachers in high school to be able to identify and improve students' writing and of course their reading are part of the new syllabus processes and are part of the syllabuses that will emerge later this year. So while those results are shocking, and I agree with you in relation to ERO and the other writing results, the national NAPLAN results, the first step in improvement is making sure that teachers have the tools to work with, and the new syllabuses will do that. And if we can arrest the decline in K and 2, there'll be less people who are illiterate and less low SES kids illiterate in 3, 4, 5 and 6, and any ones that slip through that net should be able to be improved as they go through, so that by the time we're in Year 10 we have very few students who can't write at the national reading level, and that's the intention of the new syllabus.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer. It seems to be in touch with the reality of the problem and how you might fix it, and you can add to that the Year 1 phonics check. There's a big advance as well. So it's a long pipeline, but that would give us some hope for the future. The opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Chair. So, Mr Martin, just to clarify, the new syllabus will provide support, sort of catch-up measures for kids who have missed out on phonics?
So the syllabus is a sequential. Cater 2 has the phonics, systematic synthetic phonics, plus the beginnings of writing that require students at an early age to begin to identify what a sentence is and how to build sentences into paragraphs, etc., age appropriate. 3 to 6 will do the same. For a teacher who has students that haven't met that required level by the year they're in, they'll have the syllabus material that the students should have addressed earlier and be able to intervene. That'll go right through to Year 10, so that if you have Year 7 students who are at a Year 3 level, those Year 7 teachers will know where the students are up to. But the intent is to catch as early as possible so that you have less issues going through. But the syllabuses that will emerge very shortly will have sequenced writing, including sentence, paragraph and text structures in them for the first time in quite a while.
And I know that we're requiring now our teachers to do their professional development in the specific areas. Is there any plan or are there any requirements to do it around writing, in particular for those particular years?
One of the things that NESA and all 3 sectors will be doing is providing a lot of support to teachers, because making sure that they can teach the writing, in particular the grammatical structures that haven't been taught really for quite a long time, including in my own life at school, which goes back to the late 1970s. So we're going to have to do a body of work with teaching professional learning for teachers, but we're ready to go. It'll be something that changes the nature of schooling for kids. I think it's groundbreaking, but we've got to bring the profession with us, and that will begin from next year.
Okay, thanks very much.
If I could add, Ms Houzos, in terms of writing, Mr Graham can provide some information around the support we are providing to schools and writing. We have, as we did with the phonics check, identify the need, make the move, and we will see the results from that, and we are doing the same with writing. We are working on strategic support for our schools under the school success model around writing. It is one of the focus areas that we are having that support around, to make sure, as Mr Martin has said, that teachers are supported in their work.
Yep, so New South Wales has a huge amount of strategies around writing, so professional learning, effective writing, so we look at the evidence base from K to 6. We look at creating texts in years 3 to 8 and strengthening writing from 5 to 8. We also have introduced the check-in assessments, so we now have a writing check-in assessment, which is something we haven't had a lot of before, and that was undertaken in late term 3. So we've got tens of thousands of kids who've undertaken this check-in assessment in year 6, and we'll be providing schools those results shortly. New South Wales has strong results in writing. You can see we've got a strong emphasis through the syllabuses, but we do rank number 1 in Australia in NAPLAN for years 3 and 5, and 2 in year 7. Senior secondary has been more of an issue for us. Best in class process is really focused on improving writing. So we take teachers who have strong writing results in the HSC within their subjects, so not just English teachers, but art, other subjects as well, and we take them 50% of the time and put them into schools that have been struggling with writing, and that enables us to actually spread that practice across. So it's very practical. It's one of the most popular pieces of professional learning that schools do, because they actually get to see top quality writing samples. They explicitly learn how to teach kids to get those samples, and they can replicate that through the HSC.
Okay, Mr Graham, just one quick question, because we're running out of time. Can you just tell me if those check-in assessments that are being undertaken, my understanding is it's years 3 to 6 at the moment, are those results available for parents?
Well, we're looking at how we report those results to parents. So at the moment, the check-in assessments have been focused on the classroom and the teacher. So obviously, unlike NAPLAN, we don't have...
No, I have a straight question for you, Mr Graham. Are they available for parents?
They're not currently available for parents.
Okay.
Ms Houzos, if I may, they're a tool designed to support teaching and learning in the classroom. They are a tool designed to take a quick snapshot of where a student is so a teacher can adapt their practice. We very much want to maintain them as a low-stakes test that is there to inform the practitioner in the classroom around the best strategies to support them. And when teachers receive the results for their students from the check-in assessments, they also receive pointers towards strategies for those students and the identification of their areas of need moving forward.
But you would be aware, Ms Harrison, we visited a number of schools, this committee, in various different inquiries. A number of schools already do provide those to parents. Why don't you do that as a matter of course across the board?
And so we are working through the issues of how we would do that and how we would do so in a way that didn't impact on the workload of our teachers at a system level.
All right, so I'd like to turn back to Edmundston Park. Mr Manning, we talked about this extensively in budget estimates in our earlier hearings. I'd like to ask you about a tender document that's been provided to us under a GIPA request. You might be familiar with it. It's the tender document that outlines, well, I can just read it to you. The request for tender, strategic advisory panel, strategic transactions, Part B specifications. Are you familiar with this for Edmundston Park?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the actual document, but I'm familiar with the project.
Great, I can give you a copy of that one then. I've got a few copies here. So I'm interested, we talked about Edmundston Park. Now I understand you told us previously that these planning documents were not produced by the department. The document that we talked about in estimates earlier, in our earlier hearings, that talked about 9% of the development being retail. But this is a document that is prepared by School Infrastructure New South Wales. I want to take you to page 2 of the document. Under the background, in the second paragraph it says...
It's listed as page 1 of 4.
Yep.
Yep, that one.
That's right.
Yep.
So in paragraph 2 it says, School Infrastructure New South Wales is actively encouraging industry and its representatives to identify proposals that recognise the potential value of new schools in precinct developments by creating a front door for developers. Mr Manning, did you draft this document?
So this was drafted by my organisation, yes.
Okay, so do you think it's appropriate that School Infrastructure New South Wales is characterising its operations as creating a front door for developers?
So the purpose of this document and the purpose of this exercise was really to recognise that in many cases, and we've talked about them over the years of estimates, the housing development comes first and the school comes second in terms of the timeline for delivery. This is an opportunity for us to look at the feasibility of a model where actually the school comes at the same time as the development for the housing comes as well. And so that's the reference that it means. So it actually is recognise the potential value of new schools. So rather than waiting 4 or 5 years through a VPA process for a school to be delivered, we can actually work in partnership with the developer to ensure that a school can be delivered as early as it possibly can be, and recognise that actually brings some value into the proposition. And we think that there are some value for money opportunities that exist as part of that to allow us to accelerate. And so this is a test of a feasibility of that thinking. And this tender documents for Ed Park is designed to solicit and understand whether we think there really is a value proposition there or not.
So the idea would be that the developer would contribute funding for the school. Is that the alternative model? So
I think it's not necessarily contribute funding, but if
well, there are multiple references to alternative procurement, developer-led models.
It's about
feed into our school design and delivery models. I mean, what else are the developers contributing if not money?
It's about value too, right? So if a developer is going to build 20,000 houses, there is a scale of construction activity that's going to occur that actually means that if the school was included as part of that delivery process, there would be savings available because we wouldn't have a separate prelim set up. We would be buying as part of that process rather than anything else. So there's a whole series of value opportunities that present itself with this, and the Ed Park tender process was designed to really test the market to see whether we thought there was value in that process or not.
So just to be clear, you're saying working in partnership with developers does actually then include joint retail considerations.
So again, this is a document we've put to the market to get their feedback on what they think adds value and what doesn't add value. There's nothing in this document that suggests whatever deal they offer us we will take, or that any deal they offer us that we will take. But it's an exploration of where we think that feasibility sits, what value it it brings to the system, and some of that may be speed of delivery, some may be actual genuinely cost of delivery as part of that process, and other ancillary things that could be delivered alongside a school that happen in every day. So, you go to a lot of high school spaces and you'll find commercial developments of things that pop up around the school that actually could be delivered in unison that would have some value into this process. So this is us, I think, as we said at the last estimates, just testing the feasibility of whether this represented an increased value for money proposition.
Document is dated March 2020, so obviously you've had some time to assess those things, the feasibility.
So we've been
what is your assessment over 2 years on about whether or not these kind of alternative developer-led models are feasible?
So this document was created in order to solicit an actual bid from a developer. So the analysis that's done across other sectors, including the university sector, would suggest there is some value in it. What we've not actually done is actually receive a value for money bid that we could commit to, and this process was part of that. And we have received a bid, and we are currently evaluating that bid to see whether we think it actually represents value and is a bid that we would proceed with.
Is that the Edmondson Park bid?
Yes, that's the bid that we've talked about before, and you'll know from previous questions, we have a site for a high school, so we have a standalone build option that we can implement if this doesn't represent value for money to us.
And when will the bid be it's currently being evaluated? When is it due to be determined?
So I think it would be fair to say we'll have it concluded before the end of the calendar year.
And the bid is, you have to excuse my ignorance, obviously I'm a ring-in. Mr. Diadam apologises, he has COVID. But the bid is, a developer has come to you under this framework and said, we will build the new school if you let us put commercial space on the footprint, and that saves the government money. That's why you're interested in it?
No, it's not just about that at all. So
it is partly about that?
There are elements of that that could genuinely have value and are worth exploring.
I mean, it's always going to be better, it's always going to be in the interest of developers to say, oh yeah, we'll chuck a school on if you let us have this housing and, retail space here as well. Why wouldn't it always be in their interest to do that?
But we're trying to see not whether it's in their interest, but whether it's in our interests. This tender is about whether actually it's in our interest for them to deliver a school to our design and our specification at a reduced price to what we would deliver it to. And if there are opportunities to identify additional value, then I think we have a responsibility to taxpayers to make sure that we're getting the best bang for buck we possibly can. If it's
so, Mr. Manning, just to be clear at the moment, you have a standalone site for the high school that is adjoining the primary school.
Yes.
But you are currently evaluating a bid from a developer in response to a tender that has been issued by you, that there is a possibility that you would build a nine-storey high school on top of a commercial development. That's correct, isn't it?
So the tender document seeks to solicit from the developer what they think adds value to that process or not. Okay. The document you saw, we talked about last time, was effectively a document with the beginning of the statutory planning process that indicated some commercial. We have subsequently received a bid from the developer that we are evaluating.
Okay.
But I can confirm to you that the bid that we've received from the developer does not include commercial.
Okay. So what does it include?
It's a school.
On the site in the shopping centre?
No, there's no shopping centre. There's no commercial. It's the school. They've offered to effectively erect a school for us, and they've put a proposal to us that we're currently evaluating to see whether actually that represents better value for money than if we got on and built a standard school on our own site.
Again, excuse my ignorance, but what's in it for them? They're just not doing that out of the goodness of their heart, Mr. Manning. So why have they offered to build this school for the New South Wales government?
As I've said before, with a lot of developers, there are a couple of layers to this. So one of them is the fact that if they are active in a region anyway and have already committed significant construction resources, it makes sense, to bring a school on is a marginal cost in the setup of the site and a whole range of other bits, as opposed to starting again, which is a cost-saving measure. There is also from there an interest in ensuring that the school is there as quickly as it can be. And
okay, Mr. Manning, we all accept that this makes the development easier for them to sell, and that's we can take that as a given. Mr. Manning, what explicitly do they get in return in the proposal that we talked about in the last budget estimates? It was 9% retail and 9% community facility. What is it?
No, this is not about what they get in return. This is a tender process for them to bid to us, for us to know what value they can bring to us to do it. So no, there's no kind of quid pro quo process in this. As I say, we have left it open for them to look at kind of commercial development as part of a school and how that might integrate. Now, the two things might be...
Sorry, can you just say that again, Mr. Manning? You said that there might be a commercial development as part of it.
The way this document works, it allows for them to consider the value of commercial development alongside the school. Right. Now, that might not be in the same structure as the school. It might have a completely separate front door in a completely separate building to the right or left of the school building. If you're imagining that this is a shopping centre and the entry to the school is up an escalator, that's not how the model works. That's not how the specification works, nor would it be what we've asked to do. You'll be familiar with lots of high schools where there are lots of shopping centres adjacent to high schools. So those things are all available anyway. This is an opportunity for us to test the market, to see actually when they put their money, kind of where the proposal is, whether this represents value and what it is they think brings the value to the table for us to decide whether we want to proceed with it or not.
Okay, but Mr. Manning, as my colleague has outlined, we don't expect developers to be doing this purely from the goodness of their heart. They are private companies that require a return. What is it that they are getting in return? What is happening to the existing site that is next to the high
Nothing. We're
school?
holding on to the existing site.
Okay, so what is it? Is there an agreement then that they are allowed to... So the tender that is currently underway that you are evaluating is for the private developer to build a high school on the site that is adjoining, that is not the one that you own, but it's on their site.
On their site, yes.
Okay. And so are they considering commercial development adjoining that?
So, Ms Houzos, if I may, this is a tender process that is live, and so there are commercial and confidence elements to it. It was also, I think, as Mr Manning has clearly articulated, our interest in this as the Department for Education is the value we can get for the New South Wales taxpayer in the delivery of a school. No decision has been made in relation to this proposal. It is at this stage, it is an exploratory process that we're undertaking to test that value that is available to us, and we are absolutely open to saying if it doesn't give us value that we wouldn't proceed with it. But I am just conscious that the government has also made no decision in relation to that at this stage. So I just want to make sure in terms of the questioning, Mr Manning may need to take some things on notice given the commercial in confidence nature of the tender process we're engaged in.
Ms Harrison, I accept that that's a tender process that's underway, but this is a remarkable step by the Department of Education, and it was one that Mr Manning and the Minister tried to talk down in previous budget estimates hearings as though this was a planning document that wasn't theirs, that this wasn't happening, that this wasn't underway, and now we find out that it actually is. That the department has continued to engage with developers in this way, and that there's been no communication to the public. This is a fundamentally different way of delivering schools.
I think in terms of the last time we met to talk about this, we confirmed that this was a commercial model that we were testing, right? The documents that you handed across were actually documents from the developer themselves as part of them testing the framework around the statutory planning process. They weren't documents generated by us. And so I kind of refute the idea that we've been doing this covertly. We haven't been doing this covertly. This has been through e-tender. This is a procurement process we've been running, and we've been very open the fact that we have been running a process to see whether it represents value or not. You have yourself articulated the value this brings to the developer, which is in terms of their ability to develop their proposals, particularly around residential development, knowing that a school is going in day one as part of the joint use of that development. That does genuinely have value, and this is an attempt by us to effectively understand whether that represents value back to the state rather than waiting a period of time for the developer to complete their development and then for us to come in and acquire land and build a school at a later date. When the development phases are out of sync, the costs for development are then different because of the scale of development and because actually there's no ability then for any of the kind of value capture type concepts that government has been looking at across the portfolio for a long time. Ed Park was one that we really wanted to test. We've had good conversations. We've seen other sectors engage in this process. What we've asked for is a tender where actually we have a firm price that we can properly evaluate to understand whether it represents value or not. And to the Secretary's point, you know, I have a site to build a traditional school on, so I know exactly what that will cost me to do. If this doesn't represent value for money, then we won't be proceeding with it.
I mean, do you understand, Ms Harrison, though, how it's slightly problematic when we're trying to ask questions about the investment of public money in public education and, you know, school infrastructure, obviously a critical part of that, a big part of the public money that we spend on public education. The response that we're getting is, we can't give you that because it's commercial in confidence.
So I think actually the fundamental reason I can't give that to you is because decisions have not yet been made by government. I think it is appropriate that a department is seeking to provide the best value for money for a taxpayer. I think it is appropriate that we consider those factors. And I think it is appropriate for us to give options to government on that. But ultimately, there remains a decision to be made that has not yet been made in this case. And I think, as we've indicated quite clearly, we are not interested unless it delivers value for the taxpayer and for public education. That's what we're looking at this for. And if it doesn't stack up, that wouldn't be something we would be recommending government proceed with.
Ms Abigail Boyd.
Thank you, Chair. So just continuing on with that then, because I also find it quite extraordinary and I feel that we've had a bit of a run around on this. Mr Manning, you talk about how the value is derived from there not being a development that's out of sync with the development of the school or with the building. As though only the private sector could marry those two things up, whereas a smart government would be able to look at the surrounding neighbourhood and say, right, we're going to need a school in there soon. Why is it that the school can't? Why is it that the government can't build schools in places where they're required on time?
We do build schools where they're required on time. As you're aware, as with any government, there are decisions are made about priorities of which capital is invested in spaces. It is very difficult for us, particularly around some of the common planning assumptions and the way we've seen some of the developments play out in the last few years. It's all well and good to have a signed-off rezoning plan that has a volume of properties. It's all very well to have a developer that's keen to proceed with them. But as we see in places between sort of the Gregory Hills and Leppington, they can be very different delivery rates across those pieces. And so it's very difficult to get a sense of actually which are the ones that are going to run ahead and which are the ones that are going to run behind. It's not possible to proceed with all of them at the same time. And so we have always said from the beginning of school infrastructure, we're actively looking at procurement models that can deliver a better value for government and can also deliver infrastructure in a more timely way. In previous times, PPP projects have been used for the same sort of basis to steal a march on those things. So this is just another opportunity for us to look at how we engage with the market. But if we did deliver a school at the same time as a development, we would be using separate contractors because we have got a separate process. And in some places, we would actually be competing for resources, for the same resources, and that would actually drive up prices. One of the benefits of this potentially, assuming that it stacks up, and I say the evaluation is ongoing on this basis, is that actually we're not competing for the same resources. It's actually one focus, it's one delivery intent with one set of deadlines and dates, and that we're not overheating the market by competing for trades and resources, so that actually we can deliver what we need to.
When I look at this proposal, and I've heard you say, and I've heard Ms Harrison say a number of times now that it's about the value and the value proposition and the value for so-called taxpayers, blah, blah, blah. At what point are we looking at the quality of education for our children when education is being effectively privatised by stealth? Are we not concerned about the commercialisation of our education system?
Miss Boyd, I don't accept the premise. I don't accept the premise of that question. We are not, because we are not looking in any sense at privatising the provision of any public education, and I think it is really important that we are clear that that is not the intent. We are talking about the infrastructure only. As Mr Manning has indicated, that infrastructure and this tender goes to the specifications we have for those buildings to ensure that they meet our standards and provide an appropriate building and a built environment for our teachers to educate our students. So I think we've got to be very careful not to confuse those two things.
But it's correct, isn't it, that you're doing, what you're looking at here is the idea of doing a deal with the private sector that reduces your upfront infrastructure costs in return for that developer getting a benefit in a commercial way, which can only come from it associating itself or having buildings very close to the school.
So, Ms Boyd, I would say that is correct in any method of building that we would do in a development. The provision of a school in a growth area around development, of course, adds value to the developer. What we are trying to do is see if there's a way we can capture some of that back for the taxpayer of New South Wales, rather than it all going to them. That's what we're considering. Whether or not that stacks up, as we've indicated.
And not be influenced by the private sector, couldn't you?
No, I think, Ms Boyd, what the Secretary's saying is, wherever we add in a school, we add value. Wherever we put a school in, we add value. And so it's
probably the opposite of that. It's wherever you don't build a school.
We've done the research on it. Wherever we add in a school, we add value to all of the
Can we just clarify though, because you've spun that the wrong way?
No.
If we go from the assumption that the population should be given a certain number of schools and hospitals and all the rest of it, in places where there isn't that stuff, of course that's going to be the lower.
No,
just on a point of order, if we can stop the interruptions when someone's interrupting someone else and just go one at a time, it'd be really helpful. Mr Manning, to give your explanation.
Yeah, if I could just finish the point. What we have found traditionally is when we add schools into existing developments, we add value to those developments. This is an opportunity for us to understand whether actually getting into the cycle with the developers that are delivering those residences, actually that may be an opportunity that we can capture some of that value in a reduced cost to the state that actually allows me to stretch the dollars that I have further and further, as we might need to do. That's the intent of this as a model.
Okay, but again, as with every other bit of privatisation this government does, it's short-term gain for long-term pain. You're putting yourself in a position where you are then answerable to a developer or in agreement with the developer for a longer period of time.
No, I don't. Sorry. I don't agree with that as a premise. That's not the terms of the deal that we're offering. We are talking about the delivery of infrastructure. In order to enable us to do the things we need to do. Once that infrastructure is delivered, it's delivered and the school is operational. I don't know what lingering things you think we're putting into the deal to make it work, but that's not how it works. It's not what the tender documents ask for. So this is purely about the delivery of infrastructure.
As my colleagues have explained, in order for a private business, and we all understand how the business world works, in order for a private business to want to invest, they must be getting something from this too, and that must be a commercial benefit. Where is that commercial benefit coming from if it's not coming from the surrounding neighbourhood? Why are we not building independent schools? Is it that we've got to the point where our Department of Education is so devoid of independent expertise that it can't organise itself?
Ms Boyd, we have delivered record numbers of new schools, and I don't think that is a fair or appropriate question of officials here today. We have delivered our schools are public schools. Every single one of our schools is a public school that we own and operate. As Mr Manning has indicated, we are looking to see if there are ways of ensuring that within our budget envelope we can deliver the maximum value and the maximum classrooms across the state. As we've indicated, when you build a school in a growth area, it affects the property prices in that area, and that in itself itself is a payback. And if we can get the school in early and have a look at, and all we're talking about here is looking at this stage. We have not made, and I want to repeat, we have not made any decisions on this. Government has not yet taken decisions on this. We are simply testing whether or not there are developers who are building in those growth corridors who might be willing to invest in a school at an earlier point in the development cycle to assist us to get a school operational sooner and to stretch the value of those dollars. We are not talking about handing over ownership. We are not talking about privatisation of the education provision or of the asset. We are looking at a different delivery model.
Sure. I think.
Sorry, could I just clarify before I hand to you, because I believe something was misunderstood there. At no point was I criticising the the education officials. I'm talking about government policy when I'm talking about stripping the department and its direction when it comes to its lack of independence.
I think, Ms Boyd, it would be appropriate at this point that I comment that school infrastructure was created 5 years ago. We have grown the capacity in the Department of Education to deliver and maintain infrastructure to record levels, and we have delivered a record-breaking programme. And I'm really proud of the work that our staff in school infrastructure have done to achieve that.
Yeah, could I just say, I can understand what Mr Manning's trying to achieve, and I think Mr Manning's a very good official. But it's also true that as soon as you put a school near shops, the shops commercially benefit from the vast number of kids and parents who will use the shopping centre. And instead of this sort of joint venture or public-private co-location model, would it be more effective, cleaner and less susceptible to these sorts of criticisms and maybe problems in the future if the state government levied a development levy from the commercial interest to say, you know, this is the amount of money you'll benefit from our guarantee in the master plan of a new Leppington or whatever, that there'll be a school near the shops and you get the money off the developer to help build the school.
Certainly that would be another way to try and capture the value that the school inherently creates. The problem would be how we legislate to make that happen. But essentially what we're trying to do as an agency is deliver as much as we can with as little as we can, so we can stretch it as far as possible. And if we think we see a way to deliver at a better price point that doesn't compromise any of the infrastructure that we deliver or any of the delivery of education as part of that process, I think we have an obligation to follow that and see whether it works. And the Edmondson Park is an opportunity for the developers to actually put a price on the table that is fixed and firm, and for us to do an evaluation of whether it is worthwhile pursuing or not. And we are in the process of doing that. If it proves to not be worth doing, we simply won't do it. And at Ed Park, I have a site and I can build a high school adjacent to the primary school. Yeah,
but don't you think that's a substandard position then? If you don't do it, the developer still gets the commercial benefit of having a school in that area fully funded by the taxpayer. I mean, development levies are not unusual. We've had them for 40 years at local government level. We have some at state level. Why don't we build in a new school contribution from these developers who hit the jackpot when we build a school next to their shopping centre?
Point of order, Mr Chair. While I think it's a very reasonable question, I don't necessarily think it's a reasonable question to these officials, as it is a policy question and should be
put to the
government, which I'm sure you will do at one point.
Yeah, well, would the officials recommend that to government as an alternative to be considered?
Happy to raise that with the Department of Planning.
Thank you. Could I just come to the replacement for local schools, local decisions, which has been abolished, thankfully. The replacement notionally is a set of school targets that have been postponed until next year. Why doesn't the Department Secretary mandate the 5 important things we know that work in schools and would make every single school more effective? That is explicit instruction, teachers teaching, synthetic phonics is the best way to read, a disciplinary model like Michaela or Marsden Road that works, Hattie's collective efficacy, and the work health and safety requirements that every school should enforce, and were notably absent at the Castle Hill disaster. Why don't we just do the 5 things that every school should do?
So thank you for the question, and I might just give one example before I hand to Ms Walker to give you some further insights. I started this term at Minchinbury Public School, a fantastic school in our system that has seen a significant impact on its reading. I saw there the power of moving from one delivery of instruction around reading to a new one for that cohort, and has had a significant impact.
Well, what's the new method?
So they have moved to a fully phonics-based method in their school.
That's good.
And that is certainly at the core of all of the support we provide to the system, and that certainly goes to the professional development for teachers, the line management of principals and the engagement with principals through their director education and leadership, looking at the evidence-based practices we want to see and focusing the efforts of schools on those practices. And we are certainly starting to see the results. I would indicate, Chair, if we had a system that was smaller and more contained, that might be a more easy opportunity. We have 2,200 schools. We have humans running and leading and practicing in those schools, and we need to work with those professionals and provide them with the skills to implement those strategies that we want to see, and that's the work that we are doing. And I'll ask Ms Walker to provide some more information on the school success model.
Thanks so much for the question, and just on the mention of the extension to the targets, just to be clear, we know that the targets are changing around NAPLAN. That was based on some national decisions around NAPLAN. So the ones that are being extended into 2023, so not a long distance into the future, is HSC, attendance and belonging. I think in the 5 things that you mentioned, the things that are really interesting in that are the explicit teaching and, as Ms Harrison said, the phonics. And that really is the nature of our PL, it's the nature of our best in class. We see it with our HSC best in class. It is that absolute firm example. And what we know is that we have strategies under the school success model where we look at targeted, tiered and focused work, whether it is strategic, guided or universal, that gives a consistent way for us to approach our very large cohort, as we said, 2,200. So to move that cohort in the one direction to get the lift that we're looking for and the lift that we're seeing within the school success model brings that. Where we can be more explicit, as you described, we are looking to do that, but we also need to make sure that we ensure that we are respecting and understanding the profession of teaching and the development that teachers and principals need to do, and so that we're lifting them with the foundational pieces of their workplace. Where we can be more comprehensive and say this is the core foundational piece, we have been doing that, for example, as I said, through the strategic, the guided and the universal support. So I think we are, the 5 that you mentioned, would we be in firm agreement that they're the 5? I think it's fair to say no, but there are certainly a number in those that you mentioned that we are being much more directive about this is the way we do work around here.
Right. Well, on that, Ms Walker, is it really a contradiction to say teachers are professionals, but there's no central mandate to say to professionals, you've got to follow the evidence in these key areas, explicit instruction, synthetic phonics. The evidence is absolutely clear. It's not optional. This is what works and you need to do it. It's the equivalent of lawyers being told they need to follow courtroom rules, doctors being told they need to follow certain procedures that make their patients healthier. Why is teaching saying that teachers are professionals, but there's no expectation that they rigidly follow the evidence base? Not left or right or some ideological question, but just what works in practice.
I know a number of my colleagues would have a view on this that they probably want to express, but I think what we provide for our teachers is the best evidence, the best research base that we can for them to apply in context, because you can't operate in a state like New South Wales without having the context of the teaching experience, the student experience being considered every step of the way. But we do provide that research and evidence base, but I'm very happy for any of my colleagues to jump in about that.
If I may, Chair, I think one of the things is you draw on the medical example, and I think we often see, you use keyhole surgery now, not open heart surgery, for example. You have to train the professional in those skills, and so that has been the big investment of the organisation over recent years, and it continues to ensure we are offering the professional development for our staff, that that is very much bounded by those evidence-based practices. We do not offer professional development from the Department of Education that is not based in evidence. I think, as Mr. Martin has indicated around the curriculum, we see all of those tools coming together and aligning across the system. So we'll have the curriculum, the training and development of teachers, and then the practice in classrooms. I note that as part of the Commonwealth work at the moment, there is work underway around initial teacher education to make sure at that very entry point we are preparing and we're engaging the university faculties in that evidence base and making sure that it flows through into our teachers. And Chair, if I may, I just wanted to make sure I was clear on some figures I gave before around the best in class and the HSC work, because I think I might have had the wrong number in my head. But our best in class initiatives very much focused on the evidence, very much focused on what is working in classrooms. Across that, 98% of teachers who have undertaken that professional learning indicate the intent to change their practice as a result. The evaluation of teaching and student work samples following that professional development has shown significant impact. So, for example, in writing, analysis of almost 200 student work samples in 20 schools has shown that the professional learning improves students' ability to write quality text and use grammar effectively. Our professional development has supported over 4,500 teachers, but I note that we have, on any given day, around 90,000 teachers working in and around our schools. Our scale is part of our challenge here, and that we're across 450 schools. And we've seen that for teachers who maintain their engagement with that professional development, we see the impact on their student outcomes. And so from 2019 to 2021, 184 schools that were highly engaged with the professional development for the HSC saw a 4 percentage point increase in the proportion of bands 5 and 6 in the HSC. In education terms, in Hattie's size of the efficacy impact, that is hugely significant. And for those that had a medium engagement in the professional learning around their faculties, had a 2.7 percentage point increase. And so what we are seeing is high engagement in evidence-based practice and professional development is changing practice in classrooms and is impacting on student outcomes. And certainly I know in all the conversations I have with high school principals, and I'm sure this goes for my colleagues as well, the appetite for more of that training for their staff is there. The teachers that are engaging in that training are waxing lyrical, quite frankly, at the benefits of it and at the level of stretch for them intellectually as providing into their practice, and that's what we want to see more of.
Well, just coming back to reading, if all these wonderful things are happening, say, with synthetic phonics, how can it be that around 40% of students don't successfully sound out a majority of the Year 1 phonics check words? Doesn't that indicate that the teachers aren't teaching? Like, it's a truism that if the students aren't learning, the teachers aren't teaching. And if 40% of kids aren't getting through the Year 1 phonics check, it's an indicator the school is not actually teaching and practising phonics.
And so I note that's the figures, I think, from the first year the whole system undertook the phonics.
The first year result was worse. It has improved, but
so the first year was a sample, and then the second year was the whole system, and we should shortly have this year's results. We don't quite have them yet, but we will do shortly, Chair. And I am confident in a sense of the work that has gone on this year, and through the COVID ILSP and other interventions that we've put in place, we would expect to see some increase there. And we have in reading seen sustained growth in performance, and we are seeing growth in student outcomes. And Mr. Disdar can give you some further examples of that.
Do you look at the phonics result of a school that's lousy, the Year 1 phonics check, and say to the school leader, this just indicates you're not teaching phonics or you're not teaching it very well, and intervene and make them do it? I mean, it's a crime against the kids that they can't read.
And so certainly the strategic support we have is targeted at those schools that need it most. The guided support being provided by our Director's Educational Leadership is absolutely embedded in that same suite of resources all the way through. This is no choose your own adventure, from the universal resources available for a school to access themselves and use, to the materials and support provided by a Director Educational Leadership alongside a school team, to the very intensive strategic support where we go in and work alongside a school. The resources are aligned, the resources are evidence-based, and they'll back in the new syllabus accordingly. So we've gone for that very clear alignment through the whole system to be clear on what we're trying to achieve and make sure that's what's coming through our system.
Thank you. The opposition?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manning, I wanted to come back to the tender document. So the tender document is actually for a strategic advisory panel.
Yep.
How many members have been engaged as part of this panel?
I'll have to take that on notice. That, as you say, the tender was for some consultants to help us with the evaluation process of this. So I'll have to take on notice exactly how many consultants we've taken on board as part of that process. But there's quite a lot of work in the evaluation of this sort of concept to make sure that we thoroughly vet it, thoroughly understand it, and understand the implications of it before we would work through what we think the right outcome and decision would be.
Can you tell me how many have been engaged?
Sure.
What the full-time equivalent is? I mean, the document outlines that it could be up to 2 days per week, but it might be less than that. There's peaks and troughs it refers to. Can you tell us how many days they've been engaged for and what the total amount is that they've been paid?
Sure. Today, I'll have a look at the information that we've got in that space. I'm not sure we would have a sense of the FTE. We're not.
Sure.
It's about workload, and we're trying to give people a sense of what we think the workload might be, rather than how many days they'll be in doing what we do. But yeah, I'm happy to take that on notice.
Total amount and total hours paid for then?
Sure.
Great. And how many people have been engaged?
Yep.
And this is obviously an ongoing role that they're continuing to do for you, is that correct?
This is about evaluating a series of opportunities for us. So yeah, we know we've got Ed Park. Depending on where we go beyond that, there may or may not be others that we would do, and there may be in terms of other shapes. So yeah, we're looking for some consultants that could support us with that without necessarily make a decision about how many projects it might be or where it might go. That's why we've gone to consultants as part of that.
So they're currently considering Edmundston Park.
Yeah.
What other projects are they considering at the moment?
Well, as you know, for the delivery strategy document that we produced, we identified a series of projects that we thought there was some merit in. At the moment, Edmundston Park is the only one that we've received. We're going through a bid evaluation process for. We're not looking at a bid evaluation process for anything else at the moment.
Okay, so that's the only one that you've received a bid from a developer about. Is that correct? The others are open if others want to make bids, but they haven't actually been considered yet.
No, so this is the only one we've actually put an RFP out and got a response. The others aren't at that stage yet.
Okay, yet. So they're open to be considered.
They're open for us to consider what we want to do next, or what we think is the right value for money step.
Okay, what's your priority order? I mean, Edmundston Park High School was promised in 2018. The land is sitting there. You could actually just build a high school on the existing site at the moment, but instead you're going through this process where you're engaging with developers and seeing whether maybe you build it on another site.
To see whether we could get better value for money, yes.
Okay, but the community sees a vacant block of land sitting there. They see a promise that was made by this government in 2018 to build a high school, and at the moment you're out consulting with developers to see whether they can build it on a different site. If the developers were to build this particular high school, when would construction begin?
As soon as we're through the statutory planning process. Effectively, so that would be the next step for any of the options that we go down for Ed Park, is the statutory planning approval, and then we'd get straight into construction from there. As you know, we're building the primary school at the moment. That was always our priority, to deliver the primary school before the high school. The primary school will come on stream day 1, term 1, 2023, and then we would roll straight into the high school, and we'll put in an EIS together in order to go through an SSDA approval and appoint a contractor to get on and do the work, assuming that we would get on and build it ourselves rather than this model. And we'll have a decision closed out on this before the end of the calendar year, and we'll be able to proceed with whichever option we think is the right one to go down.
But you have to start the planning process again.
Yes, as part of every project we have to start a statutory planning process that can take 6 to 9 months depending on the complexity of it.
Okay, so can I just ask, I understand there's a tender that's underway and I take that on board. You said that there is no retail component in the bid that's currently...
The bid that's under consideration, yeah, there's no retail as part of the offering that's been made to us.
Okay, so but when you say that, there could be retail adjoining it or in the surrounding areas, is that correct?
On land that we don't own, yes, absolutely.
Okay, and is there a community facility that's part of the consideration?
I'd have to check that for sure, but we were very keen to encourage community facilities as part of that process. As you know, when we build schools, we try to position school halls and things so that actually they can be accessed by communities out of hours as part of the school process. So again, we would want to make sure that that's processed. I'd have to check. I'm not close enough to the bid. The evaluation team are doing that. I'll see that when it's finished.
Okay, and can you tell us, is there going to be a school oval as part of, you said that they would have access to the oval when we considered the earlier planning documents? As part of this bid, will they have access to a school oval or will they have a school oval?
Again, I'm happy to check the exact detail of it, but the reality is we would retain the land that we currently own to provide that function if we needed it.
Okay, now you said that you're looking at the department's interests, you're looking at whether it's value for money. Do they explicitly include students' interests? What's the best outcome for a student?
In what regard?
When you're evaluating this bid, how do you weight the interests of the student?
In the same way that we evaluate the interest of the student with every project that we build. So with every project that we build, we look at the design process, we look at the location, as part of our standards and specifications that are clear about size of classrooms, location of classrooms. We would do extensive consultation with the school performance executive and teams, and this project has been through that as well. So from a design perspective, that's how we assure the performance for students, and we've been through that process as part of the design process for the offer that we've made on Edmondson Park. And to be clear, it's fully compliant with the EFSG guideline that we've developed that actually supports all our school developments.
And so can you tell us on notice what is the height of the school that's being considered? We talked about 9 stories in the previous document.
You mean the height of the building or the height of the school?
Height of the school and height of the building.
Okay, I'll have a look and see whether we've got that detail.
Okay, if you can come back to us today, that'd be great, or if you have to provide it on notice,
It would be, yeah, let me see.
Okay, excellent. How long have we got, Chair?
Got 12 minutes.
Okay, I'll pass to my colleague.
Take us through to morning 2.
Morning. Mr. Martin, can you confirm that you approved DGS 19643, which recommended the Minister approve the purchase of a site at 9 Gregory Hills Drive, Gledswood Hills? This is for the high school.
Mr. Manning.
Manning,
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Sorry, can you ask the question again? I thought you were asking me.
There's a DGS 19643 which recommended the Minister approve the purchase of a site at 9 Gregory Hills Drive, Gledswood Hills. This is for the Gledswood Hills High School.
I'd have to be honest, I'd have to come back on notice in terms of the exact details of the brief.
Sure. So I've got the brief in front of me, and it says here, approved Anthony Manning, CEO, Schools Infrastructure New South Wales. Back in 2019.
That would be me, but yeah. I can't say that I remember every brief that comes across my desk that I sign.
Okay.
I'll just interrupt at that point and welcome to our hearing a delegation led by Mr. Dae-Jung Kim, the Governor of Education in the South Korean province of Jeolla, visiting the New South Wales Parliament today and sitting in on the deliberations of our Education Committee. We welcome you and hope that your visit here today is a great success. Thank you, and Mr. Buttigieg.
Thanks, Chair. So, do you recall that the department actually had made offers on the land and negotiations had advanced to the point where the vendor had actually agreed to sell the site to the department for $21,500,000?
Can't say that I do recall, no. So I'd have to have a look at the brief to refresh my memory.
Okay, well, it's in the brief I've got here. Is the department still of the view that a high school's needed there?
Yeah, and I'd have to take that.
I mean, this is not necessarily state secret stuff. This is demand that's been aired in various budget estimates hearings, questions in Parliament. So you're telling me that you're not aware of the demand in that area for a Gledswood?
I'm telling you that the 2019.
And you don't recall the brief at all?
I don't recall the brief. No, okay. I'd have to have a look at it to jog my memory. There are a lot of briefs that come across my desk.
Sure. Well,
I don't have to hand any formal advice on that. I'd have to take that on notice to understand.
Well, if I table the brief for you that you approved, Mr. Manning, would that perhaps help if you have a look at it? And
may help, yeah.
Yep, you'll see here that the department had actually agreed to purchase the site for $21.5 million and recommended same to the Minister. Can I table that, Secretariat?
Yes.
Thank you.
You would be aware of, we visited Gledswood Hills Primary School, we visited Gregory Hills Primary School. You would be aware of that part of Sydney, Mr Manning, and the need for a high school. You would agree that...
I'm aware of that part of Sydney. I'm aware of the primary schools that we're putting in place. I can't say off the top of my head I'm across what our high school strategy is at this moment in time. Happy to look at the
selective, surely.
Happy to look at the
After all
brief.
these years, surely.
Happy to look at the brief and see whether it helps.
I mean, we're talking about almost 4 years ago now, aren't we? That brief would have been given to the Minister.
Aren't you building a high school at Edmondson Park?
We are building a high school at Edmondson Park.
Well, that's part of your strategy. Do one at Leppington, a selective.
At Leppington as well, yeah.
I'm here to help.
You would be aware that there is a need...
Do you have a copy that's actually got my signature on it?
No.
Okay. So I don't know that this brief went anywhere or even got to me. This is a brief that has my name on it, but it doesn't have my signature on it. I don't have memory of a conversation about this piece of land, and that's possibly because the brief never got to me and I never signed it. It never went anywhere else. Do you have a version with my signature on it to help me?
Mr Manning, we've got that document that was produced to us. I'm interested to know whether it's your testimony that you have no recollection of a recommendation being provided about a need to purchase land at Gledswood Hills for a high school.
I can honestly say I have no memory. No, that's right. I see a lot of briefs that come across my desk. I have no memory of this brief. Now, that doesn't mean the brief doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that I didn't sign it. I would have to look into TRIM and see whether there is an official signed copy of this brief with my name on it to know whether actually this even got as far as me and I even signed it off.
Okay, can you take that on notice?
I think the witness is taking that on notice.
Happy
to check and come back to us later as to the status of the brief.
And Mr Manning, just to be clear though, are you aware of the need for a high school in Gledswood Hills and in that part of Sydney?
Again, I have to take it on notice. I'm aware of the number of primary schools we're building. I'm aware of the number of residential properties that are being developed there. I'm also aware that we are building high schools and have plans for high schools around the area. So I can't comment at this moment in time on whether we think a high school in and around Gledswood Hills is a great option for that or not. Again, I'd have to take that on notice.
Could I, Mr Manning, I do have another document here, and it's DOC 1929046, and it's titled Gledswood Hills Land Acquisition, and this one's actually signed by Richard Hayes, Director Commercial Transactions, approved Joe Lands, Executive Director Infrastructure Planning. The Executive Director Strategic Planning, as the Minister's delegate, is required to sign a letter of offer for the proposed purchase of a new high school site located at 9 Gregory Hills Drive, Gledswood Hills. So it appears as though a formal proposition was put up to purchase the land, but the department has, as a representative of the department, you have no recollection or knowledge of that.
No, and it may well be that an offer was made as part of a process of negotiation, but at a point in time we had better developed strategies for delivery of a high school, and so decided that the land wasn't appropriate to build a high school on. So you'll know we've recently delivered Oran Park High School that has significant capacity sitting in it. So again, I'd have to deal with it as a question on notice, so I could understand what was in TRIM, what the conversation with the team was at the time, and what the ultimate strategy ended up being.
So you're not aware of whether or not the proposition was formally put to the Minister, notwithstanding the documentation that I've tabled, and happy to table this one as well?
No, I think that the next step in that process would have been me to sign this off, because this is me notifying the Minister of our intent to do it, and that's the document I need to go and check and see whether that actually progressed or not.
Okay, could you come back to us today on at what stage that got up to, whether it was actually presented to the Minister, and if so, what the Minister's response was? Because it seems somewhat incongruous that we've had 4 years pass, clear demand for a high school. I mean, every man and his dog knows the requirement out there. There's 2 public high schools in excess of 2 two public primary schools, Gledswood and Gregory Hills, in excess of 1,000 kids. You're talking about putting demountables on Gregory Hills next year, and the idea that 4 years ago there would have been a brief go to the minister about purchase of land for a high school and we don't know where it's up to now is somewhat strange, I would have thought.
Just for clarification, the demountables are going on to Gregory Hills Primary School so we can open it as a new school day 1, term 1, 2023, ahead of the formal construction, which it'll start in readiness for 2024.
So just on that point, when you promise a school, what was the original promised delivery date for Gregory Hills?
I don't think there was a promised delivery date, and as we've talked about in previous estimates, the land only came to us, I think, towards the back end of 2020. So we have been working on it since. There will be a pop-up school. I will check in trim as to whether that advice was ever provided up to the minister. I'm also happy to take on notice and talk to my team about what the ultimate strategy was. But if we didn't acquire the site, then I strongly suspect that we had alternative strategies for delivery of a high school for the students around that area, and happy to come back on notice in terms of what that strategy was. But noting that Oran Park has capacity, we're obviously talking about a high school at Ed Park, and we made a commitment around a selective high school in Leppington.
But if residents there are on the promise, for example, of a school at Gregory Hills first term 2023, is it reasonable for them to expect a permanent structure be built? Because presumably what's going to happen now is you're going to have a whole lot of construction activity around. First you've got to install the demountables, then you've got to pull them down, then you've got to construct the actual buildings. So when the government goes out and says we're going to deliver this school by X date, do you think the residents and families out there expect a permanent structure by that date, or demountables on the never never?
So the strategy we've got is we'll put in demountables for a pop-up school for day 1, term 1, 2023. That school will sit there until the new school is finished. There's sufficient size in the site to enable that to work very effectively and very safely.
And Mr. Manning,
the new school will be delivered as we would do normally. We're probably proposing to use modern method of construction, so we can actually deliver that school as quickly as we're able to once we've been through the.
So what's the timeline on that?
Statutory planning process. So at the moment, the pop-up school will go in for day 1, term 1, 2023. We're working hard to put the SSDA application in. That will really be the determiner in terms of the date of opening. What we're seeing.
So we could conceivably be having the stopgap measure of demountables for conceivably years before the. So,
Chair, if I may, I know the committee visited some of our pop-up schools as part of your inquiry. They are exceptionally high-quality facilities. They are designed in a way to support effective delivery of education. They offer a great solution to a community quickly. Yeah. I think, as Mr. Manning has indicated, we are in the planning process. We're looking to use the modern methods of construction, which would enable us to deliver the permanent school on the site as fast as possible.
No, I understand, and the question was not about the quality or efficacy of demountables. The question was do you have a timeline for the permanent school to be delivered? And if the answer is no, that's fine.
Well, I think, as Mr. Manning has indicated, we are in the planning process, and as soon as we have the planning outcome, we will be able to give that timeline for the school.
But to be clear, the planning approval is in place for the pop-up school, right?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was listening to some of the answers before about this sequencing or the alignment of delivery with clear demand and growth in these particular areas. And Gregory Hills, a classic example. What is the issue here where we seem to be getting delayed by periods of 4, 5, 6, 7 years? So you have all these suburbs spring up, massive demand, and yet government seems to be dragging their heels on the delivery of basic infrastructure like schools. I'm talking about both primary and high schools now in that particular area.
It's not quite how I would characterise it. But if you take Gregory Hills as an example, the site at Gregory Hills was part of a VPA. Within the voluntary planning arrangements that's agreed with DPE, there's often a trigger number of lots that the developer processes before the land becomes available to us. And it may well be as part of those ongoing conversations with planning that actually we look to bring those triggers far earlier forward, so land is available to us earlier than would be. But in some, they have the ability to develop 3, 4 or 5,000 plots before the VPA site comes to us. We also had occasions where actually the work the developer does in terms of progressing the development means that the site that might be allocated to us isn't finished and serviced at the beginning of the development. So the roads and the infrastructure that goes to support that site isn't there. We've had a few of those. We've had some delays in that process whereby actually they've got to go through a DA to get the site ready for us before we can put the school on, have the roads around it and the services infrastructure into it as well. So again, as part of the process of engaging with DPE, we can look at future VPAs and understand whether actually we could bring sites on stream much more quickly, and whether we can actually get the developer to front end the work. So actually the school site may be one of the first things they build rather than towards the back end of the development and how that works. But they're all conversations we need to have with DPE, who lead the negotiation around those developments and provide us with the details around the VPA as it would do for other agencies as part of that process.
Okay, thank you. We now break for morning tea, and tomorrow morning we can all read the Infrastructure Committee report, which is being tabled.
I'm going to start with something completely different. We've been asking for a couple of years about the issue of period poverty in schools. And I know that after our questions, I think last year, there was a commitment to do a period product trial, which was really great. I understand that that took place and in July in relation to answers to questions I submitted on notice. The department indicated it was still planning on rolling out pads and tampons via dispensers in schools. But I understand that that has now been swapped as of September to a different scheme, which is for period underwear instead. And I just wanted to understand how that decision came about, perhaps if you could tell me what the results of the trial were, and why it was decided to instead go with something that hadn't been trialled.
And so, Ms Boyd, I might kick off here and say we're delighted we're able to address this issue across our schools. We have not replaced any one item. What we have sought to do here is increase the choice available to support our students and to make sure that within that we are also looking at more sustainable options available for young people. And so it is an expansion of breadth rather than a replacement.
Okay, great. That's really good to hear, because as I'm sure you know, a lot of the circumstances that lead children to be unable to access pads and tampons make it next to impossible for them to be washing period underwear and doing things like that in their homes. So it's important that they also have that ability to get tampons and pads. Although we'd love it if everyone had that sustainable option, obviously it's just not possible for many children. So in terms of the pads and tampons then, are they being provided via dispensers in schools, or is the idea for these products that you need to go and ask for them?
I'll ask Mr Manning to provide the specifics.
Yeah, so we visited over 1,900 schools to assess the need for dispensers, and we've been rolling dispensers out since the beginning of term 3. The intention was to have them all rolled out and completed during term 4, and I'm happy to take on notice the number that remain to be delivered, but my understanding was the target was to get them all delivered ahead of term 4, and that program has rolled out. To the Secretary's point, we've launched a procurement process around the period underwear as part of the feedback we got from students. And we'll continue to refine our procurement processes, particularly around the products that feed into the dispensers, so we can make sure we can drive the best value we can through schools, and they are being issued to schools already as part of that process. But the plan is through dispensers, and those dispensers have been rolled out and are currently operating.
Okay, that's really excellent news. And so is that in public schools as well as private, or are private schools doing their own?
Okay. So we are responsible, obviously, for the public system in relation to this programme, and certainly I know, I'm sure there will be schools in other sectors who are taking a similar approach, but we don't have information on that. That's not collated by the department.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask you about out-of-pocket expenses that are paid by parents for students who are going to public schools? Does the department keep any data on sort of the average out-of-pocket costs?
Could I ask, Ms Boyd, obviously out-of-pocket costs for attending schools can include everything, including uniforms and bags. Can I just check the scope of that? Is your intent here to understand the whole cost of sending a child to school in terms of those uniform bags, etc.? Or were there specific areas that you were interested in?
Yeah, so I'm looking at, in particular, any sort of imposed term fee, the expectation of voluntary contributions being added onto amounts being sent out to parents, you can pay this, which puts people under a lot of pressure, but also subject contributions, unpaid volunteer hours, and of course excursion fees.
Certainly. So I'll ask Mr Disdar to provide you with the information that we have available on those matters.
Ms Boyd, we communicate annually right across all our staff and also our principals reinforcing the message around voluntary contributions. There are no school fees in the public education system. It's a voluntary contribution. That means families may or may not make that contribution. We also stipulate the rate at which they can increase that voluntary contribution. We don't leave it to a school to determine. So we give, if required, an annual percentage increase that they can apply to that. That's been frozen for the last 3 years, respecting and recognising the impact of the COVID operating environment. In that advice, we also reinforce to our secondaries, because you'd know, Miss Boyd, when you get to year 9 and 10, you start to select subjects and electives, and then into your HSC preliminary studies. So there's subject contribution fees that apply in secondaries. We stipulate the guardrails around that as well, that it must go to things like material composition, etc., to be able to undertake those subjects. And in providing that advice to families, schools are required to communicate how a family can seek student assistance from the school if they're unable to meet those subject requirements. In other words, we protect, Miss Boyd, no student's exclusion from the curriculum on capacity to pay those subject fees.
Thank you for that information. With respect, it wasn't the answer to my question, though, which was, do you keep track or any data of what the average out-of-pocket expenses would be? I understand that there are rules and you've got some regulations and oversight over that, but the question I'm asking is, despite all of that, does the department capture data on the amount, the average amount that people are paying, so that, for example, you can look and say, well, clearly that school, increasing over time, or this school pays a lot more than that school, why might that be? Is that data collected?
I mean, I'm glad I was able to give you the voluntary contributions information, but we don't centrally collect. Miss Owen may want to add stuff. She's saying that through the Finance Directorate they've got some information, so I'll let her add stuff.
Thanks, Mr Disdar. I think I can answer part of your question, Ms Boyd. So we do collect information centrally across the system about voluntary contributions from parents and, as Mr Disdar was describing, subject matter contributions. I think we do publish this information, but I could give you, for example, the 2021 figures across our public school system. So in 2021, I'm going to round this figure, but I can give you a notice. The full figure is 26 million for general voluntary contributions and 38 million for subject matter contributions.
I'm interested in seeing how that varies over time as well. So if you've got that data showing over the last 5 years, how that may have increased or decreased, that would be very useful.
It's decreased, Ms Boyd. But I think 2021 we'll all recognise was a slightly unusual year in the education system. Obviously, there was a term when many students weren't at school, so I wouldn't read anything too much into the trend, but we'll take on notice providing you with the 5-year trend.
Thank you. And finally, before I hand back to the Chair, just a quick question about how much money the New South Wales Government has paid, whether through grants or any other form of payment, towards the infrastructure spend at private schools and independent schools.
Let us take that specific on notice to you, Ms Boyd, and make sure we can give you any breakdowns that you're interested in terms of that number as well.
Crossbench time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms Boyd. Could I ask, Secretary, in terms of pedagogy, what is student self-regulation?
And so I will ask Ms Nixon to provide with a view of that.
So thank you for the question. Are you talking about self-regulation in terms of behaviour, or are you talking about self-regulation in terms of learning?
Learning.
In terms of learning, I'm not familiar with the term in learning because self-regulation.
What about student direction?
Student direction?
Yeah.
Well, yes, that would be a more familiar term. So student direction would be where the teacher provides a beginning teaching structure, so provide information, and then would provide a scaffold around in which a student would be asked to identify what is it that they would take on as the project topic, for example, around a piece of work with some scaffolding around it.
Right. Why does the department fund this mob at Newcastle University quality teaching rounds when they push student self-regulation, a concept you're not familiar with, and student direction, which sounds like it's the antithesis of explicit instruction?
So, self-regulation, if we're talking about behaviour and about classroom learning, it's often for our high ability students. So it's often for students who, have that capacity to show their own leadership in their own learning, who may be ahead of the rest of the group, that have the capacity to create a framework around what is their next piece of learning. But none of that happens without teacher direction. None of that happens without teacher support. When we talk about learning, we talk about, I'll take on the information, the teacher provides the structure, and then it's about what is the next steps in that learning. And as we know, we have students who are able to do that learning and have that self-directed part for themselves.
Right, but why are we paying $5 million to this mob to do anything other than show teachers how to do explicit instruction? Because aren't they part of the cancer inside the system where a lot of teachers now see themselves as facilitators? So but the students are self-starting learners doing self-regulation, self-direction, and the teacher walks around with a cup of coffee dropping in on these little project groups, which is normally code for one kid does all the work and gets some junk off the internet.
So, Chair, that is not my understanding of what the Quality Teaching Rounds programme is about. The Quality Teaching Rounds programme is led by Professor Gore at the Newcastle University. It is based on a quality teaching model that has had academics look at it over a period of time, and the feedback on that model is it is rigorous and intellectually sound. The Quality Teaching Rounds model is one of observing practice of teachers and providing feedback to teachers on their practice. So a group of teachers form a round and they go and observe each other's practice and provide feedback, and they have that kind of explicit feedback around their own practice and move on to the next school. That is the model, and it's one of the things we have invested in as we have sought to see, to discover which of those models of observation are the most impactful on improving teacher practice, because we know that regular feedback and having observations of classroom practice from other professionals that teachers welcome into their classrooms is one of the things that improves teaching practice in our schools.
Right, but the department disapproves of the notion of teachers as facilitators?
So teachers, as we have discussed here already today, are absolutely, there is a clear requirement for explicit instruction across the whole curriculum. There is also room, as Ms Nixon has indicated, for there to be areas of student-directed learning within a scaffold, particularly to provide stretch for those students ready to take their learning to the next level. And as we seek to build independence in our learners, one of the things we often hear back from universities is that public school students attending university thrive because of that independent learning that they have developed in their public schooling. So it is also a skill that our students need throughout the rest of their life, that they can guide their own learning and independently seek to learn and maintain that learning culture.
If students can be independent learners, why do we need teachers?
As
How
I
can
said,
students
Chair,
ever learn unless they're actually looking at the teacher?
So, Chair, as I said, it is one part. Explicit instruction is absolutely a core part of the delivery of every syllabus, without question. And you would see explicit instruction within every classroom across our system. But there is also room within that syllabus to take that explicit instruction, to take that knowledge and information that has been supplied by a teacher, and for students to take and explore the concepts of that, and to explore that independently and to guide that themselves. There is room for that, but not outside of there being explicit instruction in the classroom.
Okay, well, I asked the question about this quality teaching rounds on the notice paper, and the answer I got back, having put in my question, Cece says that what works best is obviously explicit instruction. Why don't we just use that instead of this nonsense about student self-regulation and student direction and self-starting learners. And the answer came back that CC What Works Best is a guide, not an exhaustive list of effective practices. So what did CC leave out of what works best that's an effective practice?
And so in terms of the quality teaching rounds and the role they play here, Chair, they are observing the practice of a teacher in the classroom. That What Works Best documents provides part of the framework they would use, and I know the University of Newcastle have a quality teaching model that underpins that work, and that they're observing the implementation of those practices in a classroom. Those rounds provide feedback to an individual of their practice. So in terms of the way...
What did CC leave out? It's not an exhaustive list. What did they leave out?
And so I will ask Mr Disdar to comment here, but in terms of the exhaustive list, it does not set out every single thing that a teacher would do in their day. What it does is point to the absolutely core practices and behaviours you would want to see in every planned lesson that is delivered.
Well, the quality teaching rounds in this answer, the evaluation of it was conducted by the University of Newcastle. So they evaluate themselves, so not surprisingly they say they're wonderful. But classroom observation in itself is not enough, is it? For the sake of it, you've got to be actually directing teachers to the high value-added practices led by direct instruction.
And so that is exactly the work I think I articulated to you in the last session, Chair.
It's not what the answer says about them, but if I can come to a specific example with reading.
Chair, if I just may, I mean, we have worked in partnership with the Paul Ramsey Foundation in engaging with the Quality Teaching Rounds programme. The results do show from that programme an impact on learning outcomes for students. And so I think we are interested in knowing more about that because we are interested in seeing those student outcomes improve.
Yep, no, we all are, but the data doesn't show that. So I'm always wondering how these wonderful practices are sending the system backwards. But if I can ask specifically about Lumiere High School, where parents complained in Year 7 the students were studying gender stereotypes and gender studies in English. And the answer came back that they're looking at previous media depictions of how women have been portrayed in the past and how those have changed through the decades. And further, when I said, look, you've got a big problem there of kids who can't read and write, the answer is there's wonderful improvements. How does the department explain then, in Year 7 reading in the NAPLAN last year, it was substantially below both students with a similar background and all Australian students for Lumiere High School, and they've lost 20 points on that measure since 2014. It's been in steady decline. Wouldn't we be a lot better to teach these kids how to read rather than a political topic they can work out as adults, whether they think the depiction of women is fantastic politically or it's undesirable? What has depictions of women got to do with teaching these kids in a disadvantaged community where 52% of them are in the bottom quartile to actually read?
So I might ask Mr Martin to comment in relation to the requirements under the English syllabus that are being taught and the...
Isn't the first requirement to teach kids at Lumiere High School how to read? Make sure every single student in English in Year 7 can read, which clearly isn't happening. They're studying depictions of women in the media. Blow me down.
So the syllabuses allow for a range of stimulus and material for which to allow students to explore and understand a range of texts. For example, if you had a Year 7 student and you were reading something that was
No, that's not reading. These are pictures of women.
Pre-20th century, in history or in English or in other subjects.
It would be politics, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't suggest that. I wouldn't suggest that it would be politics to make sure that students understand that depictions of gender or race has changed over time.
So what? What's that got to do with English and learning to read?
I think it's an important part.
It's a political issue for adults.
I think it's an important part of understanding how a text works, but it's different from the mechanics of reading. And by Year 7, a student should already be able to read because of the work that's done in K to 6. But I think it's reasonably usual for a teacher studying an older text or studying history to explain how particular depictions were in the past, quite legitimately. I don't see it as diametrically opposed to teaching students to read.
Who's doing something about the substandard reading NAPLAN results at Lumiere High School instead of pretending and effectively misleading us on the notice paper to say that strong improvement pathways are evident? It's just not true. People have got to get out of a state of delusion and get real about disadvantaged kids in a struggling neighbourhood who've got one chance in life, that's the government school up the road. And if you don't teach them how to read, You're keeping poor kids poor. And I don't know how you sleep at night with this sort of rubbish. I don't.
The school is committed to improving its reading.
Well, they're committed, but what are you doing in practice?
Let me answer, Chair. So,
no one's got to be angry on behalf of these kids because no one helps them.
We concur with you that it should be driven around improvement around those key areas of literacy and numeracy. I can tell you that the school has got ambitious targets for reading and has shown improvement in the top 2 bands for reading on the targets that we set with that school 2 years ago. On the 2021 NAPLAN results for the top 2 bands, that school has moved forward from where it was.
They're not the struggling kids who can't read. It's the bottom 3 bands.
They are the
bottom
targets.
3 bands have dragged the whole school down below the Australian average and the similar student background average.
Where I wholeheartedly concur with you, Chair, is we want
obviously a significant number of kids in Year 7 at this school who can't read.
We want to move students through all the bands.
They're studying media depictions of women.
Every student we want to
move. And the parents are complaining. I don't invent these things. I find out because parents complain to me. They say, you know what they say to me? Why have I got to then spend money on out-of-school tutoring?
I want to reiterate that the school...
They had the money, they'd leave this wretched system and go somewhere else which taught their kids how to read. So all these passive answers about improvements and support disgust the parents in practice and disgust me.
I'm just giving you factual coverage for Lamia. On its target for top 2 bands for reading, that's a target that's been set across the system in every single school. This school has shown improvement from the target that was set. Does the school acknowledge that it's got...
How are the bottom 3 bands going?
Does the school acknowledge...
How are the bottom 3, the kids who can't read, how are they going? They still can't read.
I don't have those results.
No, of course you don't. Of course you don't. It's all set up for nonsense, delusional answers instead of the real problem.
Well, I don't concur.
Of course you don't. Well, if you don't know, what sort of job are you doing if you don't know how the bottom 3 bands at a disadvantaged school like Lumia are going?
I'm simply giving you the
What responsibility do you take if you don't know?
Let me reiterate. I'm giving you coverage on.
You think you've sort of been in this job too, like a clerk that recycles these answers instead of goes out to the school and actually puts your foot down and demands solutions?
No, well, you're zooming in on Lumia, and I'm giving you on the system targets that have been set for that school, the factual coverage on those targets.
The top 2 bands, and you say you don't know anything about the bottom 3 bands who are the kids in need, the ones who can't read. If our system is not geared up for helping kids who can't read, why do we bother?
Yeah, and I said to you, Chair, that we concur that while the target is the top 2 bands for reading and numeracy that have been set across the system, it's about moving all students from where they are further forward. And yes, we would want to move the students that are in the bottom bands up from those bands as well. But this is a school that has shown improvement in reading in the top 2 bands. It's a school that's shown improvement in the HSC top 2 bands. And it's a school that needs to focus stronger on numeracy as an area of weakness. And we'll go back and look at its bottom bands that you've replayed.
If you can do that on notice. Thank you. The Labor opposition?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask on the voluntary school contributions. Ms Owen, is it possible to provide us with a breakdown by school of how much is received?
We do capture that by school, yep, so we'll take that on.
So can you provide us on notice for 2021, 2020 and 2019? I appreciate that that's a big ask, but we're obviously over some pretty unusual years in 2020 and 2021. Yep.
On notice to see what I can give you.
Great, thanks so much. So, Mr Manning, I just wanted to ask one final question on Edmundston Park. What are the guidelines currently around retail being co-located with public schools? Do you have a guideline on that?
No, the FSG wouldn't include a guideline for that.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much. So let me move on to, I asked some questions on notice about mobile phone usage, which the Chair referenced Labor's very strong policy in his opening statement. In the question on notice, it was 9517, just to help out everyone. It was asking for more details about the Minister's statement that 70% of New South Wales high schools have banned the use of mobile phones in schools. I just wanted to check, so that 70% figure actually comes from a survey that was conducted in 2019 when the previous policy was introduced, is that correct?
That's my understanding. I'll ask Mr Graham to provide you with, Ms Owen to provide you with the specifics on that. My apologies.
Yes, Ms Housos, that's my understanding too.
Right.
Okay, so that's the most up-to-date information that we have about mobile phone policy in high schools?
Done another survey since then, no.
Okay. Okay. So there's been no policy, so the 70% figure was based off a 2019 voluntary survey, that's correct?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Can I move on then to the pre-kindy announcement, which was a key part of the budget? It talked about trials in the first couple of years. Where are those trials going to be located, Ms Harrison?
So can I please come back to you on notice on those issues? I'm conscious in the witness list today those witnesses were not included in terms of the specialisms and detail of the commitment, but we are at work building the team. We launched the new division for early childhood outcomes in the department just last week, if memory is 2 weeks ago. They seem quite long weeks at the moment, so we are making sure we are setting up for success in the delivery of those budget commitments. I'm very happy to come back to you on notice with where we're up to on those trials.
Okay, and how many people are in the new division?
I can come back to you on notice with the specific position numbers, but we are certainly, this is a significant reform area for us to deliver, a significant amount of investment, and we are not overdoing it, but making sure we have the appropriate resources in place to deliver the outcomes the community wants to see.
Okay, so if you can tell us, in the new division for early childhood outcomes, is that correct? Am I using the right terminology? Correct. Then if you can tell us how many people will be in there and what are the different levels that they're being paid at, that would be great.
You certainly have to provide you with what we have as an organisation structure.
Yep, great. So how do you have any information about where the trials will be?
We're still working those issues.
Sorry, how they will be determined?
So we are working those issues through, and I'm very happy to come back to you on notice with the parameters we have on the trials and an update of where we're up to.
Okay. So in terms of mapping, I mean, we've talked about teacher shortages, we've had an inquiry into it. Are you aware of how many additional teachers will be required?
So certainly one of the key elements of this package is an investment in the early childhood workforce, because to increase the provision in the way that we wish to see the provision increased will require additional capacity in the workforce. I also note we are part of a national programme around the early childhood workforce. And so we have invested funding specifically into the development of the workforce in recognition of that. And so again, I'm happy to come back to you on notice with the specifics of the numbers there, unless Ms Walker has any of them with her today.
No, I think it's better if we come back on notice to give you the...
Okay, what if you can tell us also how many teachers will be required, and if there's a program to map how many teachers, what that process is?
Certainly there will be a ramp up, so wanting to know period of time.
Just in the microphone.
Yes. So as with any very large-scale reform, as this is, and an exciting one at that, there'll be a significant scale-up period, so we'll be able to give you an over-time view.
Okay, can you tell us when will the first new teachers be employed by the department in order to deliver it, the pre-K?
Yeah, and what I'll need to give you is would they necessarily be employed by the department, remembering that this sector has not-for-profit, for-profit, as well as departmental provision, so we'd need to look across the sector.
Yeah, but if you can specifically, I understand when you take questions on notice, you often take big chunks and then kind of provide a response. I'm really interested in a specific question. What will the first year that the Department of Education will employ a new teacher in order to fulfil this announcement?
So Ms Housel, if I can just make sure we're really clear on that, because that would be within the government provision. I think, as Ms Walker just indicated, the commitment will undoubtedly involve government provision, but it will also additional teachers into the workforce are needed across the full market or in the early childhood area. So if it is specific to our plans on the government provision side, or whether you're interested more generally in the kind of when do we first expect to see growth in the early childhood workforce to meet these demands, can I just check we're clear on that?
No, and I'm very well aware of the skill shortages. I spoke about them in my second reading speech in the House. I understand, I hear from early childhood providers and their advocates all the time about the skill shortages. I'm interested to know, and I understand that the government's commitment is for the private sector and also for the public sector. I've asked some questions about where the trials will be conducted. I've asked some questions about how they'll be determined. I'm also specifically interested in when will be the first year that the department is planning on employing an additional teacher in order to fulfil this. If they're not planning on employing them, then that's fine, that's the answer, but I'm just interested in what the answer is. Are you, as part of that mapping process, are you aware of how many additional facilities will be built?
So this is ongoing work by the team as we establish it to look at the facilities, the mix of facilities, both in and the nature of different provision and location. And so again, we are in the first 6 months of an 8-year commitment, and so that work is underway.
Okay, so if you can then tell us how many at the moment or at today, how many additional facilities are they expecting to be built, and what are the factors that will judge, that will decide where to put those new public facilities?
Certainly, and I can assure you, Ms Houzos, the key factor that will determine where those facilities are will be based on the demand within the community for those facilities.
Okay. Are you looking at compensating existing private facilities?
I'm not sure in what form are you indicating there for compensation?
So are you guaranteeing that you will only put public facilities in areas where there is currently demand outstrip supply?
I am not making any assertions yet, Ms Houzos, about what the provision will look like. Mm-hmm. That work is underway to map what the need is. We're working in collaboration with both the not-for-profit sector in this area as well as the broader sector to ensure that we are meeting the overall needs of the community.
So I'm interested to know whether you're looking at any compensation packages or any kind of what funding will be provided to private facilities.
So I would not be in a position to give you a definitive answer on that at this stage in the development of the work, but I'm very happy to come back to you once a decision on that is made with any certainty to provide that to you.
Okay, can you take that on notice and see if the people in the department who are charged with this have anything more to answer, to provide?
Certainly, I would just again iterate that we're in about the 6th month of kind of developing an 8-year reform programme, and I would be very happy to come back to you with what they've got, but I would just recognise we're in the very early stages of that work.
I understand that it's in the early stages. This is a huge commitment. We're just trying to ascertain, and we're just trying to get some more information about where it's at and what is actually going to be delivered.
And certainly what I can say today, Ms Houzos, is we have under the Start Strong free preschool programme, we have extended that to families using any type of preschool programme, and we've done that because our first focus here is on the needs of those communities and making sure that no matter what service they attend, if we take a very student-centred, young person-centred approach here, we want to make sure that every student, every early childhood student gets to access that fee-free preschool.
Okay. Are you? Well, that brings me to my next question, which is the initial article that announced the program said that at first families will pay and then it will be free. Have you got a time frame in mind for when that free period will kick in?
So in terms of fee, we are already providing fee-free relief for preschools, in community preschools, government preschools, and now we have a total of $1.3 billion over 4 years from 2023 to provide that fee relief for families with children in preschool, no matter what service type they attend. And so we are starting to provide relief to families from next year, no matter their sector, but we are unable to take away all of the fees as yet. And so until we have our first trials in place around the pre-kindergarten year, that is when we will be able to address that, and I'm happy to come back to you with our current understanding of timelines on notice.
That would be helpful, and if you could also tell us whether in the trials, whether that will be entirely free. I understand difference between community preschools and preschool programs in long daycare centres, and I understand that the government has finally provided the preschool component for free, but I'm interested, irrespective of where the child attends, I'm interested to know if the trials are actually going to be free in their entirety or whether it's just going to be the preschool program component that is going to be free.
I'll need to come back to you on notice.
Sure. Can you tell me how many preschools the New South Wales Government has built since 2011?
And so we have had a consistent number of government preschools throughout that time. I believe the number is 100 from the top of my head, and we have not increased the number of preschools that I'm aware of in that period.
But there's 100 that are currently operating, and there's been no new ones since.
There are 100 government-operated preschools. There are other preschools operating on some school sites by other providers, and obviously, depending on the needs in the community, there are a variety of preschool provision in the community beyond the school gate.
Okay, and perhaps on notice you can tell us on how many school sites do private have new
I would say at this stage, I would not be aware of a school site off the top of my head that has a private provision operating on it, but I'm happy to confirm that on notice.
A private or a not-for-profit? You just said that there were some school sites.
I do believe we have some school sites where a community provider is operating on the school site. I'm not aware of a site where there is a private operator operating in a public school setting, but I'm happy to come back to your notice with the breakdown.
Yeah, so whether it's community, whether it's not-for-profit, whether it's parent-run, whether it's private, if you can provide that on notice. I mean, it was years ago I visited one, I think it was at Queanbeyan South Public School, and they've got, I think it's a KU that's adjoining.
Yep.
So how many of those new ones have been opened since 2011?
Very happy to come back to you with that on notice.
That would be great. Thank you very much. So I wanted to come to this question of, this was in the Daily Telegraph a couple of weeks ago that talked about 7,000 missing students. That was the breakdown from the national figure about 5 to 17-year-olds who are, quote, falling through the cracks. That is, that they're not attending any formal education. It was off the back of a report that was done by Professor Jim Watterson. Has anyone in the department spoken to Professor Watterson about his report?
So I'll ask Ms Nixon to provide you with some broad answer. Obviously, this report was not just about whether or not young people are attending school. They are not, what I would say to start with, they're not figures we recognise. I want to call out actually the work the department and our schools have done, particularly post-COVID, to ensure that we're getting kids back to school and that we have seen students and made sure they are safe and well. And certainly we are working across government to understand this research, the report that has come out, understand its implications for us and what we would do about it. But I'll ask Ms Nixon to provide some further information.
Yes, I've spoken to Mr Watterson about the report.
Okay, and in the article it said that the government is not collecting data. Have you made any changes as a result of that?
So I spoke to Dr Watterson to understand where he had got that figure from. It was a estimation based on some national data. So currently the DCJ have taken up the lead on understanding and verifying the data so we could identify in New South Wales what those figures are. We're working with DCJ around that.
If Ms Harrison, I think you said, I want to make it clear we do not recognise those figures or words to that effect. Is that correct?
Yes, I think as Ms Nixon has just indicated, that was an estimation based on a national figure. We obviously collect attendance rates, enrolment data and have a view of those students who might not attend one public school, and we want to make sure they've attended another. It's one of the reasons New South Wales is very keen to see the unique student identifier work progress at a Commonwealth level so that we can see where students move. This often happens in regional areas. It often happens between schools.
Ms Harrison, can I just interrupt there? So would it be fair to say that the department doesn't have an objective methodology for determining lack of enrolments based on what the evidence that's been tabled here today, yet you're not recognising this alternative study? Is that the position of the department?
I don't believe we've said we don't recognise it. I've said we do not recognise that specific figure, as Ms Nixon has indicated from her conversation. As she has indicated from her conversation, the professor involved in the work has indicated it is an estimation based on a national figure. It is not a number that is reflected in our data around enrolment and students who may move between schools who we want to check in on. That is not, it's just not a number that operationally tallies with what we see. However,
I'm just trying to reconcile this. So you do have an objective methodology for determining lack of enrolment that is superior to this study. Is that now your evidence?
So I think you are misrepresenting what I've said. We don't recognise that number. What we do have is an understanding in our system of students who are in a school, who then may not be seen in that school for a period of time, and that we have an active, engaged process to make sure we know where that student has gone, and we are following up on every one of those students. In terms of a complete lack of enrolment, if a student does not appear at a school at all, then it's very difficult for us to understand where those students might have moved to or moved interstate or other things. So we don't have across the country an agreed a way of measuring this for within school systems.
So that's somewhat problematic, isn't it? So you don't have an agreed methodology for determining the lack of enrolment, and this fellow's come up with a study which suggested 7,000, but you're questioning the 7,000 because, for lack of a better alternative, you still have a problem with it. I mean...
So what I might do is ask Ms Nixon to explain the data we do have, which is the data we're currently relying on.
If we can get a guide to how you do it, because it's inherently difficult to estimate missing kids by virtue of the fact that they're missing.
Yes.
So it was just a conversation with Dr. Watterson to understand how he'd come to that figure that was reported in the newspaper and confirm. He said he'd had a conversation, he'd looked at data across the nation, right, and this was his estimation, right? That's the detail of it. He'd looked at ABS data, he'd looked at an OECD report from 2016, I think, and worked on some other data pieces. I don't have the details of that. So he said you would need to verify that data. So that's what we will do with DCJ. And we'll actually do the work to understand what that may look like for New South Wales and get a more accurate number. It may end up being 7,000, but at this point we can't verify that data.
And Ms Nixon, I wonder if you could also just provide an outline around the data we do have for students who we want to make sure we have seen and cited.
Yeah, at last estimates I spoke about the 54,000 students who hadn't returned at the end of COVID in 2021, term 4, and how we were able to track down every single one of those to ensure that we were really clear where every one of those had gone to and where they were. So we're working on a line of sight piece to ensure that every child that leaves our system, we know where they are, we have an exit statement around it, and that we're really clear that when they say, oh, well, we're going off to this school, that they actually enrol in that school. And if that is interstate, then we're tracking that down as well. So we're going to ensure that we have the detailed data, what are we looking for, and processes to ensure that we, what we're calling passing the baton, ensuring we know where every child is.
So those 7,000 kids, do you think they're in addition to the 54,000 who didn't come back to school?
No. So of those 54,000, they've all returned to school or are all in education somewhere. So we've tracked them down. Okay.
So these 7,000 that we're trying to, that Professor Watterson says are out there in New South Wales, you are tracking them in a separate set of work with DCJ?
So no, the initial part will be with DCJ to establish what we believe the number is, right? And then from there we will do the work around how are we going to ensure where these children are.
Okay, and when are you expecting to get that number?
I couldn't make a comment on this point.
Oh, sorry, the work's just been initiated by DCJ, so they'll be pulling together a whole of government committee to have a look at that. So if a child hasn't engaged in formal education at all, which is what Dr. Watterson is discussing in his paper, then that is a child protection issue, and that's why it is best placed being led by DCJ.
Okay, our time's
Thank you. Ms Boyd is unavailable due to a family commitment. Could I ask about Merriweather High School, where probably more than any other school I get a steady flow of parental complaints, and most recently, naturally, parents not wanting a school to tell their boy that he can be a girl and their daughter that they can be a boy. And then, potentially the teachers move somewhere else, having caused the carnage. But most recently, parents were concerned that the school flew the LGBTQIAP flag on the 16th of September. And I asked a question about this, and the answer came back, the flag was flown at the school without permission. The principal knew nothing about it and then had the flag removed. Who flew the flag and what action was taken against them, given the upset and concern they've caused among several parents?
So, Chair, thank you.
What sort of school just has sort of random people who put a transgender flag up there as some political statement?
So, Chair, thank you for the question. I think as you have indicated, and as I think we have said here previously, whenever these issues arise that cause concern to committee members or other members of this House, we are very open to receiving those and taking appropriate action. That is the first I've heard of this specific issue. I will ask my colleagues if they are aware of it. Ms Nixon is aware of it, and ask her to provide you with some information.
Thank you, Ms Harrison. As you indicated, the flag was flown on the 16th of September without permission, and the principal became aware halfway through the day and took that flag down.
Who flew the flag and what happened to them? In terms of discipline, when we talk about discipline at a school, what happened to this person?
I would have to take that notice. I don't have that information with me.
And further to another set of parental complaints, what was the cost of running the Wellbeing Festival at Bellingen High School on the 21st of October, involving hip-hop dancing, ceramics and campfire cooking? Not learning how to read and write, but hip-hop dancing, ceramics and campfire cooking. What was the cost of the school of putting this full-day activity on? If you can take that on notice.
Chair, very happy to take that on notice. I would, for the committee, one of the things we know from the evidence is that students' wellbeing has a direct impact on their capacity to learn. I would also note that we've had a very disrupted year for young people, where we have seen increasing challenges with mental health and other issues, and that some of this additional activity around schools is exactly aimed at targeting that. But I'm very happy to provide the specifics on notice of the Bellingen.
Didn't you commission that literature survey from the Fiona Stanley Institute in Perth that showed that there's no evidence, no clear evidence that teachers or you or anyone else, given none of you have got any medical qualifications, can teach wellbeing? You can teach reading and writing and numbers and the like, geography, science, history, but there's no evidence base that you can teach wellbeing. So isn't it just some sort of soft diversion? And this is part of the problem in the sliding school results, that you go to some of these failing schools and they'll say, our job here is to keep the kids happy. Whatever the kids want to do about their wellbeing, that's fine with us. We don't really do any learning here.
So certainly, Chair, I visited Bellingen High School last term. I can tell you that is not the attitude of the staff at that school. The staff at that school are actively engaged in strategic support to improve their overall outcomes. And I can tell you that in 2021, Year 7 and Year 9 students achieved above average growth in both reading and writing at that school.
Where's the evidence they can teach wellbeing? It's just a myth, isn't it?
Well, so I'm happy to come back to you on notice on that, Chair, but what I can...
Well, I read your full thing that you paid for under Mark Scott commissioned this from the Fiona Stanley Institute in Perth, and it was, the jury was out. There's no clear evidence.
So the evidence we do have, and we have it from the correlations between the outcomes in the Tell Them From Me survey, and it is supported at OEC data, is that...
Happy. Yeah, they're happy. Happiness gets you a job when you grow up in Warwick Farm or Lemire.
So, Chair, as I was saying, what we do have in the evidence is that in order to be able to learn, students need to have a strong sense of belonging, and that is there is a really tight correlation. There is a strong correlation between that sense of belonging and student outcomes, and that is why our schools are looking at those issues. But as I said, I think the academic growth that Bellingen High School is seeing is the area we're most focused on, and we have been supporting them with strategic support to help them achieve that growth.
Great. Secretary, if there's a head teacher in a high school who receives an email from Adele asking her to furnish evidence of Year 12 student improvement and student academic growth and what needs to be done to achieve that, and they prepare a document, supposedly in consultation with the faculty teachers, that says that the answer they're providing is better breeding, should that teacher be still teaching in the New South Wales education system?
And so, Chair, I note that you are returning to an issue we've discussed here before, and that there has been it has been a more confused a situation than any one of us would like to see, but I might ask Ms Nixon to provide you with some
answer better breeding, and let's ask Ms Nixon. She signed off here on the approval that this disgusting comment from a disgusting person who was described in the investigation as lacking credibility, how are they still teaching in the school system with your approval?
Not teaching with my approval. I'll ask Mr Curry to comment. The investigation has occurred.
You've got your initials are here on the document. Nixon, Lamb, Curry, you've all approved someone who says the answer to these results in a working class community is better breeding. and any normal rational person just marched them straight out the door, they were allowed to resign their permanent position and a couple of days later were accepted as a casual. This beggars belief.
And so, Chair, we have a set of processes in place and guidelines, and we have legislation that guides the employment of teachers and the way we need to respond and the processes we need to follow. My understanding in this case is we've followed them. I note that you are not satisfied with the outcome of that, but I'm very...
Who would be? On behalf of the school community, how is this teacher allowed to resign as a permanent and then days later be accepted as a casual, weeks before the PES investigation was even concluded?
So I'll need to ask Mr Curry to provide you with
possible?
the specifics. Because, Chair, we have a right to a fair process for our staff, for that to be fully investigated and undertaken, and those are the processes that have been in place for an extended period of time.
You've got no problem with someone saying that the answer is better breeding. And you know the other pathetic thing about this? All these documents are covered with respect for Indigenous people. So all the thing about Indigenous, you're accepting the fact someone says the Indigenous need better breeding at this school and that person still teaches there. Seriously?
Chair, I do not, and I would take this outside of the case itself, I certainly do not support comments of the nature that you have articulated.
Do Indigenous people need better breeding? Because you've got a person knowingly allowing them to work in the school system who said that and was allowed to resign as a permanent and 2 days later was accepted as a casual, weeks before the PES inquiry was even completed.
As I was saying, Chair, certainly, as we have said at these...
Everyone in this room, if they said that about Indigenous people, would lose their job within a nanosecond. How has this person been allowed to stay?
And so, Chair, as I think we have covered before in these hearings, there is no one at this table who would support the commentary that has been made here in relation to any part of our community that we are here to serve. We do have staff who, from time to time, make mistakes of judgment. I don't think it is fair to judge a person's whole career on one statement. I do think it is reasonable for us to look and investigate and give them access to fair and due process. That's what our procedures and the guidelines we operate in seek to do to ensure that we have a fair and due process. But I'm very happy to take the specifics you've raised today in relation to the casual teaching component on notice and come back to you with any further information we have.
You say don't judge them on one mistake, but wasn't this a deliberative process where the DEL asked the head teachers at this school in the Lithgow region for their outline of what they can do to improve the Year 12 results? She says she workshopped this with the other teachers in the faculty and put down better breeding in the document. And the only lame excuse she's got is that it was the COVID period and there were bushfires. Isn't the basic problem you've got that the PES runs a protection unit for teachers and it's almost impossible to get the sack under the PES unless you're unvaccinated and they don't like you politically, or you do a Chris Dawson or you're selling drugs? If you don't sack people for doing this, you basically don't sack anyone. Why isn't the PES staffed by independent reviewers instead of people who've been principals and DELs themselves and are part of the club?
So certainly you will be aware, and I'm sure the committee will recall, that we undertook a review of the functions of the Performance and Ethical Standards Directorate a few years ago. That review was led by Mr Tedeschi. We had a series of recommendations from that review for how we could strengthen the processes within PES to ensure that we did have some of that independence. That includes now a panel-based decision process in relation to these issues, so it's never down to just one individual. I think it's also important in that area of the organisation that we do have experience of the school context taking into account. It hasn't, not all of the staff do, but some do, and that means that we have a good understanding of the environment our staff are operating in. We do have a set of legislative and policy parameters we have to operate within. Those do rely very heavily on the need for fair and due process for our staff. There are at times certainly cases that I would want to see that we could act more swiftly, but it is necessary we go through the process and come out with an action. And often when we go through those investigations, as I understand was the case in this instance, Chair, we find that there's we hadn't quite understood it as it had occurred at the first opportunity, and that actually the chance to gather that evidence and really ensure our staff have access to a fair process internally.
It's even worse than we thought. It's even worse than we thought, surely. Because there's a deliberative process where she's asked by the DEL to provide some information, workshops it in the faculty, and comes up with better breeding. It wasn't sort of like, Oh, I just thought of that, and 5 seconds later I put it down. It's a deliberative slur against the entire school community, including the Indigenous that you people bend over backwards saying you respect.
And so I think, as I've indicated, the PES process was undertaken. It has finalised. It's come out with an outcome for the relevant staff, and that we are required, and we do undertake, and we take seriously our obligations to undertake a process that delivers a fair and due process for our staff.
Fair and due process. Mr. Curry, how is this teacher allowed to resign as a permanent, seeing the writing on the wall, be approved as a casual days later, weeks before your PES inquiry was even concluded?
How is that possible? Address some of the factual information with regards to this case. As you'd be aware, that teacher was not the subject of the investigation to begin with. Their resignation was retirement taken during that investigation. They've had an appropriate remedial intervention.
Retire. 2 days later, she's back as a casual.
They've had an appropriate remedial action, and I think one of the things that's important, note that they haven't worked in a school since their retirement, but also I think one of the things that has to be taken into account is that response. Firstly, the words were never said. They were never meant to be handed up. They were on a sheet from a brainstorming session within a faculty, and there is an indication in the PSOA's, the person subject of allegations response, that it was never intended in the way that it's being read. And I think what's quite important is that often the intent of something lies with the person that has said it and not the people reading it. And I think that is incredibly important in this case. In terms of your assertion that PES is run by teachers for teachers, and I note that you've got a question on notice in this that's coming up soon. Only about 32% of people in PES are teachers. The vast majority of those work in the EPMI section, which are actually people that sit side by side helping managers with teaching improvement programs. They are people with school experience that are helping principals manage those improvement programs. In terms of the investigators that you're alluding to, very few of them have any teaching experience, and the vast majority that do have teaching experience may have done a year or two in teaching before heading off to policing, social work, child protection, industrial relations, policy, project management, and in the case of the one that you've referred to there, was overseen by somebody with DPP experience. So lawyers are a premium within PES as well. There are very few people in the investigation area that have teaching, but when they do, it is usually in coordination with policing and child protection backgrounds.
Right. When did you last work for someone other than the Education Department?
Me, I've been in the Education Department for 30 years this year, proudly so. Oh, yeah. Got a very wide experience of a whole range of school experiences, both low socioeconomic, selective, boys' school, girls' school, and also as a DEL, a lot of primary schools, and work closely with them. And when it comes to decision making, I can apply that lens of understanding this department with very clear detail and understanding of what is appropriate.
You mentioned earlier on you think the term better breeding might have been misunderstood. That was ultimately rejected in the investigation, but it was poppycock, wasn't it? The idea, a fabricated excuse, that it was a reference to the better breeding of mathematical learning.
Once again,
you must think people are idiots.
Once again, somebody's intent lies with them, not necessarily the people that are hearing it.
They didn't write better breeding of mathematical learning. They just wrote better breeding.
Are you saying that that shouldn't be accepted when somebody says that my intent is not necessarily what has been heard?
No, what I'm saying is you will accept any excuse from anyone to run a protection racket for people who should have been marched out the door within 5 minutes instead of being approved to come back as a casual.
That is incorrect.
That's what I'm saying.
I completely reject
testing
that.
Our intelligence to say this was a reference to the better breeding of mathematical learning. Seriously?
Once again, as I said, the intent, I was not the decision maker in this case, but the decision maker took the decision that a remedial action was required, but I still note that that person has not taught in a school since their retirement.
Who approved them to be a casual?
once again, that's part of the resignation process, that it will be ticked whether somebody is approved for casual. It depends then whether I have to take that on notice.
Find out who did that. We can take that on notice.
I do know that it would have been done before the PES action finalised. This person's name, as you know, was not in the frame until the investigation uncovered who had written it down, not said it, who had written it down. Before then, as you would be aware, because you were one of the people that brought it up in the first place, erroneously a principal, there was a relieving principal that we were looking at, and a principal, and this person's name came up after they had resigned. So the decision is not for us who ticked it off, whether it remains in place, and it was decided that remedial action was appropriate.
Right, thank you. Secretary, you mentioned earlier on that students should have a sense of belonging. Should they feel in our education system that they belong to Australian society?
Thank you for the question. We have a strong sense of identity through our public education system. As you're aware, we serve all communities, all Australian communities, and certainly I think that is a strong value you would see represented in our classrooms.
Should they feel like they're part of the Australian nation?
So as you're aware, there are a number of things that our schools do that reinforce that connection to Australia as a nation, including flags at every school and the singing of the national anthem in assemblies.
Right, and should they be proud of Australian history?
So certainly I think there should be... Australian history is obviously, as you're aware, and I'm sure...
a pretty good nation. A lot of people want to move here.
We are a good nation, and I know I've just finished reading with my daughter the First Scientists book by one of our Aboriginal former students. Actually, there is an awful lot to be proud of in Australian society and history, and in its full history, and I note that, and I think it's a really important thing we celebrate throughout.
And do you think Australia in its history has been a genocidal nation? And that should be projected into our schools?
I think there are parts of Australian history that have involved bloodshed, and I think it is appropriate that students are aware and are taught around those issues. But I think they're also vitally important they understand all sides of those issues in their classrooms.
Should they be taught that we've been a genocidal nation?
So I would just note that they should be taught the curriculum, and that the curriculum is set by NESA, and that is what our students should be taught. Okay,
Mr. Martin, in the curriculums, is there any evidence in Australian history there's been an official policy of genocide?
I think that this is a reasonably abstract question about Australian history, but
it's not abstract for the parents.
Certainly in terms of in Tasmania, the deliberate policy of the government was to remove and eradicate Aboriginal people from Tasmania, and ultimately they were placed, I think, on Kangaroo Island. But those sorts of contested questions need to be explored by students in history. If you were talking about overall 250 years of white settlement, you would probably not say genocidal, but there are aspects of Australian history, including what I just mentioned in relation to Aboriginal people, that they may well see and perceive it as genocidal in parts, or as having been deliberate government policy to remove them.
Right. How is NAIDOC allowed to distribute that poster to kids as young as 6, saying no pride in genocide, for which I've received multiple complaints about it? Genocide wouldn't be understood by kids who can't read. It seems to be a stretch, doesn't it, to be distributing that material? Why doesn't the department have tighter control over accurate material about Australian history and a sense of belonging to Australia, instead of any old random thing being allowed to distribute to kindergarten and year 1 children?
Yes, so I might ask Ms Walker to provide some further information in relation to the specific poster you raised for NAIDOC Week. I would note that this is a national celebration. A poster is chosen nationally to support those celebrations. It's chosen by the Aboriginal community, and that we do celebrate NAIDOC within our schools as a great chance to bring together our whole communities in our schools. But I'll ask Ms Walker to provide some specifics on the poster, if I may.
Thank you. I do understand that the poster was distributed for Year 1 students to use as a colouring in exercise at one of our primary schools.
More than one.
And I think as the Secretary has described, the NAIDOC poster and the decision about the themes for NAIDOC don't sit with the Department of Education, but we do strongly support our students participating and our schools participating in NAIDOC. So I think whether that poster is appropriate for the colouring in exercise for children of that age, I think there is a slight difference between the questions that you're asking Mr. Martin and the Secretary about the application of Australian history in the curriculum and the participation of students in a national day of celebration through NAIDOC.
The opposition, and we split this 12 and a half each.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to come back to the question about childcare providers who are on school sites. Are you aware that some have been offered only a 2-year extension on their leases?
So I'd need to come back to you on notice on that issue. Certainly, depending on the nature of procurement that needs to undertaking, we might extend an existing lease while that is undertaken. But I will very happily come back to you on notice to make sure that we have, if that is the case, the reasons as to why very clear.
And if you can tell us how many have been offered a 2-year extension, how many have been offered a longer extension?
Yep, very happy to do that.
And if you can tell us how many of those have had their rents been told that their rents will be increased as part of that extension?
Certainly very happy to come back to you with further details.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to move on to parent-run OSH services. I know this is something that we've asked questions about before. This is something that we've talked about. And I've asked some questions on notice about it as well. What's the rationale for requiring parent-run services to now have to compete with for-profit OSH services?
I'll ask Mr. Manning to provide you with details on the parent-run OSH services.
So this was a piece of work that was done, from memory, probably a year or so ago.
Yep.
So we did an audit and we looked at the delineation between not-for-profit, P&C-run and private for-profit services within the procurement rules that we have around the Procurement Act. And what we identified was that P&C run services were able to be offered without a tender process because effectively they fall under the Education Act. But parent run, which aren't within the P&C, are not under the Education Act and therefore would need to go through a tender process. We weren't simply able to offer them. So that was the review that was done. I think from memory,
who required that review? Who initiated that review?
I think this was a conversation that had started originally through one of the parent-run groups. So one of the what's the word I'm looking for? One of the key bodies around the groups.
Advocacy groups.
Yeah. Trying to understand where they should fit into the process. We took legal advice and we went through the procurement process, and the advice that came out was exactly that. The P&C run, because they effectively operate under the Education Act and under the Minister, were able to be offered services without a procurement process, but anybody else that wasn't would have to go through a tender process. From memory, I think there were something like 40 services that were essentially impacted by this decision, and we have been working with those providers to give them an opportunity to become P&C run services in time for when their leases expire and we would need to go through another procurement process. And for some of them it's many years to come. I think we tried to give them a deadline of around 2 years to move to that position, and we've been working with those providers to be clear about how they would fit under the P&C so they could continue to run their service as part of the P&C structure and therefore fall within the Education Act and not need to go to a tender process.
Okay. Can you are you able to, I asked a question on notice. I was told there was 35 parent run.
Yeah, it was 38 is the number that sticks in my head, but.
Can you provide us with the list of those parent run services on notice?
Yeah, and to reiterate, we're working with those and offering them an ability to become incorporated into the P&C so that they can continue to operate. And again, we're doing it in line with when their leases would expire and we'd need to re-tender those processes anyway. And some of those are 4 or 5 years away.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ms Manning. I should declare, I think my kids might attend one of those. I'm not quite sure. Can I move on then to Cooler Classrooms, just to get an update on that one?
Cooler Classrooms is running. It's a 5-year program. It concludes at the end of this financial year.
Yep. So let me just cut to the chase. Has everyone been told? Has all the money been spent?
I know we're still working through. There still may well be contingency that becomes available. And as we have done, we've increased the number of schools as a contingency becomes available for us to...
Weather ever get warmer?
I think that's a question outside Mr Manning's responsibilities.
Well, there's no sign of it, is there? I mean, these summers, springs now are very, very moderate.
Mr Manning...
That's where it would be nice, that's for sure.
Will they have an answer by the end of the year? What's the deadline for the answer?
Again, it runs to the end of the financial year and we'll continue to roll through the process to get to that point.
As at today, how many schools have been told in round 2?
I have to take that on notice. I think the only communication we've had with schools for round 2 is the ones that have been successful in being included within the round 1 process.
Okay.
I think we've issued any notices to anybody saying they haven't been successful, but I can come back to you on notice with that. But it's...
Can you tell me how many are successful in round 2 as at today?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I can take it on notice. I think it's in the order of 60 or 70 schools have been able to be added.
Okay, excellent. If you can provide us with the number and the names of those schools, that would be great.
92. So 92 schools have been approved for delivery.
90 schools under round 2?
92.
Under round 2?
Yeah, and I'm happy to give you the list of the names of all those schools.
On notice, or yeah?
On notice.
Yep. Okay, I just wanted to ask some questions about the new selective schools. There's obviously some changes that have been announced, the equity placement model. What consultation was done by the department with parents in relation to the changes?
Thanks for the question. I'll ask Mr Graham.
So since the release of the report into selective schools, we've consulted with the PNC, Ethnic Communities Council, the Isolated Children Parents Association and students themselves, as well as current parents of selective school students.
Okay, excellent. I might come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to ask Ms Harrison, on the 16th of September, you conducted a planning day for the department, is that right?
On the 16th of September, I think that's the right date. We, yes, had our leadership group together.
Okay, and how many people attended that planning day?
I will need to come back to you with a specific number on notice, but it was all of our PSSE 1 and above.
Okay, and where was it held?
It was held at Sydney Olympic Park.
Okay, and what was the cost of the day, including catering?
Very happy to provide the details of that on notice.
Okay, and can you provide us with a breakdown of the cost? Who was the speaker?
So we had a number of speakers. We had Dylan Olcott as a speaker. He had to join us by a video link due to attending the Queen's funeral. And we had a number of speakers, so happy to provide you the breakdown and details of costs.
Yeah, okay. And have you got a draft copy of the strategic plan?
So we are currently, our strategic plan is public. We are currently working on refreshing our strategic plan. The first strategic plan ran to the end of 2023. We have started the process to develop the new strategic plan. We are doing that with our leaders. We will be doing that with our staff during the first half of next year, with the aim of having a strategic plan in place from mid-2023 for the next period.
Okay, and when are you anticipating that you will circulate the first draft?
And so we are currently working on, I'll need to come back to you on the specifics of the timing.
Okay, if you can tell us when will it be circulated, when are you anticipating it will be first circulated?
Certainly, as I said, we want to build this in consultation with our staff across the education system. We want to make sure that we're capturing, obviously, the full reach of our responsibilities, particularly given the shift in focus in early childhood, as well as our responsibilities in the skills area for lifelong learning. So that's the focus of our work at the moment, but very happy to come back to you. I think it is more likely we'll be saying we're going out with principles and questions for discussion with our staff in the early half of the year, but happy to come back with the specifics on notice.
And if you can, I think my time's going to expire, if you can provide us with a copy on notice of the day's agenda.
Certainly. What I'd like to say is obviously following COVID and the spread of leaders and staff across the system, I certainly made a decision. I thought it was very important for our leadership group to come together and to make sure that when we are developing our strategic plan, the leaders of the organisation are absolutely the heart of the development of that plan. I would also note the need as a executive team sat here for us to build a strong and collaborative culture. I'm very conscious, as I'm sure you will have seen in other parts of the sector, for people who join an organisation during that period of working from home, it's been really important to make sure we are connecting people with their colleagues and building that connection across the piece. So some of the day was on the strategic plan and some of it was very much on building those connections and shared agenda and collaboration and culture that we want to see through the department.
Yep, I understand. Why wasn't it done at a government school site?
It wasn't done at a government school site because our government schools were in operation at the time.
Okay. Mr. Graham, I just wanted to ask you if you can provide me on notice a breakdown of the percentage of disadvantaged kids in Year 7 next year for each selective high school.
We won't have that data until after the final offers have been accepted, which would be around March next year. Okay,
have you got it for this year?
We can give it to you for this year. So that's the total, we can break that
If you
down.
can give us a breakdown of what under the current, I understand that it would be changing to next year with the new weightings, but if you can tell us what it is for this current year.
Ms Hughes, just before your time expires, I know Mr Disdar took upon himself to try and get some information back to you during the hearing, so I wanted to make sure we didn't miss that opportunity.
Yeah, I'm just keen to get a question off notice and give you this document I promised. This is the Camden Valley Way Growth Corridor Enrolment Panel. I just want to clarify for the committee, the word board was used. The board stipulates all sorts of different legal obligations. It's a panel, and this is the communication that I promised that went to all 3 schools and their school communities. There's a link in there that's really important that takes them to further info.
Great,
so I'd love to table that.
Okay, thank you. Secretary, how's the consultant certification system going?
And so just to clarify, Chair, I assume you mean the work we have underway across our system to ensure that the providers our schools might seek to use in their programmes has been assessed and clear. I'll ask Ms Owen to provide an initial answer around that in terms of, because we're working on our IT marketplace to support the provision of that, and in her previous role was leading the panel work around wellbeing.
So I think, I'm not sure what I can add to what the Secretary has said. Across our curriculum, across our wellbeing capabilities, we have produced panels and evidence for our schools on providers and the evidence base and of the quality of those, so that schools can select the right providers based on the evidence that we will have quality assured for them. Is this the information that you're looking for? Yep. So I believe 2 rounds of that has already been completed in terms of the quality of information for schools. The additional panel that the Secretary was referring to is within our technologies unit, we are also doing the same thing again for the kinds of administrative and teaching software and support for schools. So we save schools time by needing to shop around for what kinds of software they need in their school. That has been completed. We are now providing a panel which again has been quality assured and shortlisted by our IT department for schools, and that is in consultation with schools and will be rolled out next year.
Okay, so that shortlist has been determined, has it?
We've worked through that shortlist. We've been
Is Paul Simpson and a mob called Heroes, sounds good, doesn't it? Heroes, been certified in IT. They're trying to enter the system from New Zealand, no evidence base that they achieve anything. Pushing whole child wellbeing, student-centric stuff and student-directed. So again, the antithesis of explicit instruction. And they're using Denham Court Public School in that growth corridor next Wednesday at 3:45. You know, isn't the basic problem that these shysters come along promising big things, calling themselves heroes, and you find schools that disadvantaged, the results aren't very good, they're looking for the miracle solution, so they grab the next huckster consultant and sort of all their promises and pay for it. Isn't that the thing we need to stop and drive these schools back to using the evidence base that does work?
And so, Chair, I think that is exactly the work we have indicated we are undertaking. We have done so on wellbeing. We are undertaking currently a process around curriculum resources. We're looking at the next panel in terms of behaviour support, and we're also looking at this to ensure that our schools get best value for money and best quality administration systems. So
okay,
we
well,
continue
on notice,
to build
can you give me an assessment of Paul Simpson, the Kiwi heroes, and why he's allowed to use Denham Court Public School next Wednesday?
I'm very happy to come back to your notice.
And make a good coin with no evidence that he's ever going to achieve anything. And back to the quality teaching rounds and the assessment of Jenny Gore. Last year, she handed this to us in the teacher shortage inquiry. She wrote up an academic paper saying as follows: Australia has facilitated neoliberal encroachment into the education landscape by positioning schools and particularly teachers and teaching as in need of fixing. Secretary, do you agree with this analysis of neoliberal encroachment, which I've got to say, as a neoliberal, I don't find any evidence of it whatsoever?
So I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment in those terms. What I would say is I think the issue that Professor Gore appears to me in hearing that from you today is the one that we're hearing from our teachers, that the debate around education, the discussion of education is being carried out in a way that our teachers are struggling to adjust to. They are feeling challenged. They are not feeling supported in their communities, and they're not finding that debate is supporting them in their efforts in classrooms. They don't feel valued as a profession. That is the evidence we are seeing back at us, and the thing that I think one of the things we need to collectively shift. I certainly don't recognise the description Professor Gore has used there, but I think we do see a need to think carefully about the way we talk about teaching and teachers in the context of motivating those that we need in our classrooms every day to support our students, and to make sure that they do feel they have the support and tools available to them that I think we've discussed at length to enable them to do their job well.
Yeah, just on that, and this was something that came up in that other inquiry about some Monash study, I think, that teachers feel picked on in the media. Isn't the main media coverage these alarming results? 19,000 kids coming to Year 7 who are semi-illiterate, the Aero results, the stuff that your own official produced, what Masters said about declining results, the PISA results and the like. Isn't the concern that the system is going backwards? And who's responsible for that? Well, obviously government policy plays a role, and local schools, local decisions was a complete disaster. But ultimately, if the students aren't learning, the teachers aren't teaching. And it's not unreasonable for parents, loving their kids more than anyone can, to think the teachers have got to do better and your system has got to improve to turn these results around. That's not an unreasonable public or, on my part, political reaction, I would have thought.
And so I'm not quite sure of the question there, Chair.
Well, I'm just asking. You're saying teachers feel picked upon, but don't the declining results and the media coverage about these studies indicate that there's a problem in the system and we should have high expectations about fixing those problems? Like, you've got Jenny Gore here paying her $5 million a year and she says none of it needs fixing. What planet do these people live on?
So, Chair, I don't think it's for me to comment on Professor Gore, but what I think you've heard...
funding her $5 million for sending teachers backwards with rubbish pedagogy, and she's saying we're a neoliberal system, and if you take the neoliberals out, none of it needs fixing. Why would you fund her a cent?
So certainly what we fund is the University of Newcastle to support the development of an evidence base around the effective use of teacher observations, and we continue to do that. I think what you've heard from myself and from my colleagues today is certainly our commitment to see that lift in student outcomes, that we want to do so in a way that supports our teachers. We continue to deliver high quality resources developed by teachers for use by teachers in our system that is focused on evidence, and we can see the signs of those improving. I absolutely accept the lack of the impatience to see those results. I share them, Chair. Of course I do. I want to see those results yesterday. We all do. But we are seeing, where we are applying the interventions, we are seeing the lift in performance. And so we need to make sure that we maintain that focus so we can continue to see that more broadly across the system.
A few years ago, the Minister announced that the government was putting its foot down and saying to the university education faculties, unless you teach to the evidence base determined by CC and others, we won't take your graduates from you to teach in our schools. What's been the follow-through on that?
So certainly this is an issue we continue to work on, and we have put in place a number of success profile for teachers that starts to look at those issues. I would note that the National Workforce Action Plan has highlighted this issue. I understand, the Commonwealth Government have released their terms of reference in relation to work the University of Sydney will lead, Mark Scott will lead in relation to initial teacher education, and that is very clear. And I think the feedback from teachers in the room was very clear. They want to leave university better prepared for the classroom. We want to see more teachers in classrooms earlier in their degree. We want to see the opportunity for teachers to get hands-on experience sooner as part of their qualifications, and we certainly want to see the evidence base put through all of the teacher education programs on offer in New South Wales.
So what's the follow-through? Nothing.
So we continue to work both with the Commonwealth, who hold the majority of the higher education levers.
But do you say to any university, you're teaching these kids rubbish and we're not going to take them as graduates because they'll bring that rubbish into our schools?
Well, what we say is we will have a high bar for entry to public teaching in a public school. We have that through the work we have been doing over a period of time. And then we make sure the professional development we offer our staff as they enter the public education system and continue their career with us is absolutely based in the evidence. It's also professional development that is embedded in practice and in seeing that practice shift over time.
Like a CIS audit of the initial education training programs found at 31 universities, at least 27 clearly emphasised practices that are not evidence-based and did not provide trainee teachers with sufficient exposure to explicit teaching practices. On top of that, because they must be dreadful places to attend, run by Jenny Gore and other radicals, that 50% of the start-up students drop out. The attrition rate is 50%. Don't we need to look to alternative systems of training teachers who've got the evidence base and have come through a system that actually has a decent retention rate, where they've obviously been happy and satisfied to go on into this professional career?
And certainly we are looking at different ways of bringing teachers in. You would be aware of the Fast Stream program that we have underway. You will be aware of the career change program. And the thing that's different about that program, Chair, is we are commissioning...
What about alternative teacher education?
So with that program, we're commissioning the training from a university for that mid-career
which university?
program. I'll need to ask Mr. Lamb for the details on that. I may need to come back
take that on notice. But why don't you support Alpha Crucis that have got a 95% retention rate, and they use the apprenticeship model, an integration of theory and practice that, in the classrooms I've visited, it's truly inspirational. Don't we need to foster those alternative teacher training bodies?
And so I do believe we are involved with that institution, and we are supporting some of that work with an expansion of that model into public schools.
And the Anglicans are starting something up themselves. They're very dissatisfied with these clunky university education faculty. So if the Anglicans start up an alternative training system, would we support that and draw better teachers from this than we've had in the past?
So, Chair, we are actively involved in the conversations around the National Workforce Action Plan around the provision of internship models and the move into an internship model for teaching. Yep. We are actively looking at what those models could be and how they could work in New South Wales. And we're also looking at how we need to use our funding with universities to ensure we're getting the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah, is there any survey of principals of what they find with the university graduates coming into their schools? Because the graduates predominantly go into disadvantaged schools in Western Sydney and other places. Do you survey the principals to say, how do you find these graduates and their level of capacity?
So Mr. Disdar may want to make comment here, but certainly by and large, what I see in a number of those schools is because of the enthusiasm, the attitude, the willingness to learn that those graduates are arriving in our schools, that our principals are seeing great opportunity there for them to engage in professional learning with the department and other things and to make quick progress.
Yeah, but they're saying that. The principals say to me, the less they learn at university, the better, because the university stuff is junk. And if they're an empty vessel, I can pour my model into them, my school way, my model.
So certainly I think our principals...
That's very distressing to hear that, isn't it?
Certainly I think our principals would support, and I shouldn't speak for them, but I think they would support the opportunity to have undergraduate teachers in their classrooms sooner. We have seen through COVID, where we have, through the COVID ILSP program, brought more third year and final year undergrads into schools to provide that opportunity, that both they have thrived in that environment, they have had the opportunity to see and learn from the school environment far more directly, and that's been a really positive experience for everyone. And so we do want to see how we build more of that into the teacher training model. I think it's an issue we need to continue to work on, Chair.
We'll have to take Mr Disdar on notice, because unfortunately, tragically, we're out of time.
I would have loved to have elaborated, Chair, but I'll...
But no, have a crack for 90
I was
seconds.
just going to... The only thing I was going to add to that is the practicum hubs. We've been investing... with certain geography to have, rather than 1 or 2 prac students, have 20, 30 prac students go into a geographical area and to undertake that model that you were espousing of being embedded in the school context. Universities have been piloting that with us, and some of their lecturers, tutorers are delivering their material inside those school gates. And the feedback we get on those practicum hubs is very, very positive because, one, principals, mentors are eyeballing those teachers. 2, those teachers are developing in situ much more than practicum. 3, tutors, the academics, their connection to schools becomes a lot stronger. And many of those people are gaining employment prior to fully completing their studies as teaching assistants in our schools, as SLSOs, and then on graduation gaining employment as well. So,
how many of those hubs do you run? Practicum hubs?
I'd take it on notice because I definitely know that we've been expanding them, and I was going to say about 20 of them, but let's take it on notice.
Okay.
And they're in geography with a group of schools. I think they are doing wonderful things.
Very good. A positive note on which to end. Thanks for everyone's time. You can see we're all very worked up to get better results because they matter so much, you know. They matter tremendously important for the state's future, particularly kids who've got no other pathway. So thanks for your time, and we always find the information useful, and we'll see you again in the next parliamentary term, I'd say. You'll miss us. We'll miss you.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
This actually is our last hearing.
Yeah, but we'll see them in the next